Every father knows the weight of watching his children's dreams slip away because he can't provide. Caleb Marsh felt that crushing burden every single day after losing his job and facing foreclosure on their family home. Then came the letter from England. His family laughed when they heard he'd inherited a medieval castle. His wealthy in-laws called it a joke. His siblings shook their heads at another one of Caleb's failures. Even the neighbors whispered about the struggling widower chasing fairy tales. But that crumbling castle held a secret buried for centuries. Hidden beneath the foundation was an ancient vault containing documents tied to a royal trust worth $300 million. What his family saw as ruins, Caleb would discover was actually the key to changing everything. The question was simple. Would a man who'd been knocked down his whole life finally find the strength to stand up and claim what was rightfully his? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the worn curtains of the small ranch house on Maple Street, casting long shadows across a room that had seen better days. Caleb Marsh sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of overdue bills that seemed to multiply overnight, like some cruel magic trick. The foreclosure notice lay on top bright red letters, spelling out a 30-day deadline that felt more like a death sentence. He rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the family portrait sitting beside the bills. Sarah smiled back at him from the silver frame, her arms wrapped around their 3 children in what felt like a lifetime ago. 2 years had passed since the cancer took her, but the grief still hit him in waves, especially in moments like these when the weight of single parenthood felt unbearable. "Dad, we're out of cereal again." 10-year-old Emma padded into the kitchen in her worn pajamas. Her blonde hair, a tangle of cowlicks that reminded him so much of her mother, it made his chest ache. "I'll pick some up today, sweetheart," Caleb said, though he wasn't sure how. His last unemployment check had barely covered the electric bill. 14-year-old Michael appeared next, already dressed for school in jeans that were getting too short and a t-shirt with a hole near the collar. "Dad, Mrs. Peterson called about the field trip money again. It's due today." Caleb's stomach knotted. The $15 fee might as well have been $1,500. "I'll call her this morning. Maybe she can give us a few more days." 8-year-old Lucy bounced in with the resilient energy that only children possessed, seemingly oblivious to the tension that had settled over their home like fog. "Daddy, can we have pancakes?" "Please, pretty please with extra syrup." "How about toast instead?" Caleb forced a smile. "Pancakes are for weekends." But even the bread was running low. He'd been stretching everything: meals, groceries, hope itself. 6 months ago, he'd been an assistant manager at Henderson Manufacturing, earning enough to keep them comfortable. Then the company downsized, and suddenly 38-year-old men with high school educations were expendable. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd lost his job working for his late wife's family. Richard Henderson, Sarah's brother, had delivered the news with all the warmth of a winter morning. "Nothing personal, Caleb, just business." But the way Richard's eyes had avoided his suggested it was very personal indeed. The Hendersons had never thought Sarah married well. They'd made that clear from the beginning, with their country club memberships and vacation homes, their children's private school educations and trust funds. Caleb was the blue-collar guy who'd won Sarah's heart in college, much to her family's dismay. She'd chosen love over status, and for 15 wonderful years it had been enough. Now, without Sarah as a buffer, the Hendersons barely acknowledged his existence. When they did visit the children, their disapproval hung in the air, like expensive perfume, overwhelming and impossible to ignore. They brought elaborate gifts Caleb couldn't match, and spoke in coded language about better opportunities and more stable environments. His own siblings weren't much better. David, the successful lawyer in Chicago, had made it clear that Caleb's struggles were self-inflicted. "You need to pull yourself together, man. Those kids deserve better than this." Rebecca, married to a surgeon in Seattle, offered hollow sympathy wrapped in judgment. "Maybe it's time to consider what's really best for Emma, Michael, and Lucy." The suggestion underneath was clear. Maybe he wasn't what was best for them. Caleb watched his children navigate their morning routine with the adaptability of resilience born from necessity. Emma helped Lucy tie her shoes. Michael made sure everyone had their backpacks. They'd learned not to ask for things they couldn't have, not to mention friends' birthday parties they couldn't afford to attend, not to complain about the generic groceries or the thermostat kept low to save money. It broke his heart how good they'd become at being okay with less. "Bus is coming," Michael called from the window. The morning rush began, lunchboxes that held more hope than food, hugs that lingered a little longer lately, promises that everything would work out. Caleb stood in the doorway watching the yellow bus disappear down the street, carrying away the three people who meant everything to him. The house felt hollow in their absence. He walked back to the kitchen table, where the bills waited with patient malevolence. 30 days to find $6,000 or lose the only home his children had ever known. The bank had already denied his loan modification request. His job search had yielded nothing but rejection letters and automated responses. He picked up Sarah's portrait, tracing her face with his thumb. "I don't know how to do this without you," he whispered. "I'm failing them. I'm failing you." The silence that answered him was broken only by the persistent drip of the kitchen faucet he couldn't afford to fix. Outside, Mrs. Goldman from next door was watering her perfect flower garden, probably wondering how long before the neighborhood eyesore that was his overgrown lawn would drag down property values. Caleb had always been the quiet one, the steady one, the guy who kept his head down and did his work. Sarah had been the dreamer, the one who saw possibilities where others saw problems. She'd believed in fairy tales and happy endings, in the kind of magic that made ordinary people extraordinary. He'd loved that about her, even as he gently tempered her expectations with practical reality. Now he wished he'd borrowed some of her faith, her certainty that things had a way of working out for people who deserved it. The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, probably another debt collector or telemarketer. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Caleb Marsh." The voice was crisp, professionally British. "Speaking. My name is Jonathan Whitfield, solicitor with Whitfield, Pemberton, Associates in London. I'm calling regarding the estate of Lord Edmund Blackwood." Caleb frowned. "I think you have the wrong number. I don't know any Lord Blackwood." "Actually, Mr. Marsh, Lord Blackwood was your great-great-grandfather's cousin. I have documentation showing you as his nearest living relative and heir to his estate." The words seemed to float in the air without meaning. "I'm sorry, what?" "You've inherited Blackwood Castle, Mr. Marsh. I'll be sending the formal paperwork by courier this afternoon. Congratulations." Caleb sank into his chair, staring at the foreclosure notice while processing impossible words about castles and inheritances. "Are you sure you have the right person?" "Quite sure, sir. Edmund Blackwood passed away 3 months ago, at the age of 91. His genealogical research identified you as his heir. The castle has been in your family line for over 400 years. After the call ended, Caleb sat in stunned silence. A castle. In England. It had to be some kind of mistake or scam, the kind of thing that preyed on desperate people with promises too good to be true. But when the courier arrived that afternoon, with an official-looking package bearing British legal seals, reality began to shift. Documents with letterheads, photographs of an imposing stone structure against rolling green hills, maps showing its location in the English countryside. By the time the children returned from school, Caleb had read through everything twice. The castle was real, the inheritance was legitimate. There were also property taxes, maintenance costs, and legal fees that would make ownership virtually impossible for someone in his situation. "What's all this stuff, Dad?" Emma asked, climbing onto his lap to examine the papers. "Just some paperwork, sweetheart." But Michael, sharp-eyed and suspicious of anything that disrupted their carefully managed routine, picked up one of the photographs. "Is this a castle?" "It appears to be." "Whose castle?" Caleb took a deep breath. "Well, apparently it's ours now." The explosion of excitement from Emma and Lucy was immediate and joyful. Michael remained skeptical, studying the documents with an expression far too serious for a 14-year-old. "What's the catch, Dad?" "Smart boy. Sarah would have been proud. The catch is it's in England. It's probably falling apart, and we can't afford to keep it even if it's free." But Emma was already spinning around the living room, her arms outstretched like she was dancing in a ballroom. "We're royalty. We're going to live in a castle." "We're not royalty, and we're not going anywhere," Caleb said gently. "This is our home." Though for how much longer remained to be seen. That evening, after the children were asleep, Caleb called his brother David. The conversation went exactly as expected. "A castle? Come on, Caleb. This is obviously some kind of scam. I had it verified. It's legitimate. Even if it's real, what are you going to do with a castle? You can barely keep the lights on as it is." The dismissal stung because it was true, but something in Caleb bristled at his brother's tone, the same condescension he'd been hearing from everyone lately. "I don't know yet." "Well, I hope you're not getting the kids' hopes up. They've been through enough disappointment." After David hung up, Caleb walked to the children's rooms, checking on them as he did every night. Emma slept with the photograph of the castle under her pillow. Lucy had drawn a picture of the family standing in front of the imposing structure, complete with flags and horses. Even practical Michael had the inheritance documents stacked neatly on his desk. For the first time in months, they'd gone to bed, excited about something. Caleb returned to the kitchen table where the bills waited alongside the castle paperwork. Two different futures spread before him like paths in a forest. One led deeper into the familiar darkness of struggle and eventual defeat. The other led towards something unknown, probably foolish, possibly wonderful. Sarah's portrait smiled at him from its place of honor. What would she have said about all this? He could almost hear her voice, gentle but determined. Sometimes the most practical thing you can do is believe in something impractical. Maybe she was right. Maybe fairy tales didn't always come with guarantees, but that didn't mean they never came true. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Caleb made himself a cup of coffee with the last of the grounds and settled in to read every word of the inheritance documents one more time. Somewhere across the ocean, Blackwood Castle waited. The official documents arrived 3 days later in a package thick enough to stop a bullet. Caleb spread them across his kitchen table while the children were at school, studying each page with the careful attention of a man who'd learned not to trust good fortune. The castle deed was the centerpiecean, imposing document written in formal legal language, bearing official seals and ribbons that spoke of centuries of tradition. The parchment felt substantial under his fingers, older than anything he'd ever owned. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, "Blackwood Castle, Thornwick, England," followed by a coat of arms featuring a raven perched on a crown. Lord Edmund Blackwood had been 91 when he died, according to the genealogical research included in the package. A bachelor with no direct heirs, he'd spent the last decade of his life tracing his family lineage back through centuries of records. The documentation was exhaustive birth certificates, marriage records, immigration papers from Caleb's great-great-grandfather, who'd left England in 1892, seeking opportunity in America. The Blackwood line stretches back to 1387. The accompanying letter explained. Your ancestor, Thomas Blackwood, was granted the lands by King Richard II for services to the crown. While the family fortune was lost over the centuries, the property remained in trust. Caleb studied the photographs of the castle with growing fascination. It wasn't the fairy tale structure Emma had imagined, no soaring spires or gleaming towers. Instead, it was a fortress built for permanence rather than beauty. Thick stone walls, narrow windows, and a heavy wooden door that looked like it could withstand a siege. Parts of the roof had caved in, ivy covered most of the exterior walls, and what had once been manicured grounds were now overgrown with wild grass and brambles. But there was something about it that stirred something deep in his chest. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon light caught the remaining intact tower, or how the structure seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if it had always been there and always would be. It looked like the kind of place where a man could make a stand. The financial documents were less inspiring. Property taxes, utility costs, structural assessments that read like medical reports for a terminally ill patient. The roof needed complete replacement. The electrical system hadn't been updated since the 1940s, and the plumbing was described as historically authentic but functionally challenged. Conservative estimates put the restoration costs at over £200,000 money that might as well have been on the moon for all the access Caleb had to it. When the children came home from school, they found him still surrounded by paperwork. Emma immediately gravitated toward the photographs, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's like something from a movie, Dad. Look at how thick those walls are. We could be safe from anything in there." Michael examined the deed with the same careful attention Caleb had given it. "This says the castle comes with 47 acres of land. That's huge." Lucy pointed to the coat of arms. "Why is there a bird on our flag?" "It's a raven," Caleb explained. "Ravens are supposed to be very intelligent birds. They remember things for a long time and they're loyal to their families." "Like us," Lucy said with the simple confidence of a child who'd never doubted where she belonged. That evening, Caleb called Richard Henderson. The conversation was predictably brief and brutal. "Have you lost your mind?" Richard's voice carried the sharp edge it took on when he discussed anything related to Caleb's judgment. "You're talking about uprooting those children and dragging them to some falling-down ruin in a foreign country. It's not foreign. They speak English." "Don't be cute, Caleb. You know what I mean. You're facing foreclosure here, and instead of finding a real solution, you're chasing some fantasy about being lord of the manor." The dismissal in Richard's tone sparked something defensive in Caleb's chest. Maybe it's not a fantasy. Maybe it's an opportunity. An opportunity for what? To put those kids through more instability, to fail in a more exotic location, to give them something better than what I can offer them here. What you can offer them here is consistency, family support, and a chance at a normal life. What you're proposing is running away. After Richard hung up, which he did without saying goodbye, Caleb sat in the growing darkness of his living room. The foreclosure notice still lay on the kitchen table alongside the castle documents, two futures demanding a choice. His sister Rebecca called an hour later, her tone softer but her message equally clear. "I've been talking to Richard," she began, which meant the family had already held a conference about Caleb's mental state. "We're all worried about you. This castle thing, it's not real, honey. It's not a solution. The castle is real. The inheritance is legitimate. Even if it is, you can't afford to maintain it. You'll end up worse off than you are now, except you'll be stranded thousands of miles from anyone who can help you." "Maybe I don't want help anymore," Caleb said, surprising himself with the edge in his voice. "Maybe I want to stand on my own feet for once." "With what money? Using what skills? Caleb, you're a good man and a loving father, but you're not equipped for something like this. Let the lawyers sell the castle, take whatever money you can get from it, and use that to get back on your feet here where you belong." Where you belong. The phrase echoed after Rebecca hung up. Where did he belong? In this house that was about to be taken from him, working jobs that could disappear without warning, accepting charity from family members who saw him as a burden. David called the next morning with the same message wrapped in legal terminology. "I've looked into the property records," he said with the authority of someone accustomed to being right. "This castle is a money pit. The property taxes alone will bankrupt you inside a year. And that's assuming you can even afford to get over there in the first place. What if? There is no what if, Caleb. This is reality talking. You have 3 children depending on you to make rational decisions. Don't let desperation make you stupid." But as Caleb hung up the phone, he realized that desperation might be exactly what he needed. Safe choices had led him here to this kitchen table covered in unpaid bills, to this life of gradual defeat. Maybe it was time to make an unsafe choice. He found the children in the backyard, Emma pushing Lucy on the tire swing while Michael read in the shade of the old oak tree. They looked up when he approached, and he saw something in their faces he hadn't seen in months. "I've been thinking about the castle," he said. "And?" Michael prompted when Caleb paused. Caleb looked at his children, at the house behind them that would soon belong to someone else, at the neighborhood where they'd lived their entire lives, but where they'd never truly belonged to anything larger than themselves. "And I think we should go see it." Emma launched herself off the swing and into his arms. "Really? We're really going to England?" "Just to look," Caleb said, though something in his chest suggested it might be more than that. "Just to see what we're dealing with." Michael closed his book, his expression serious. "What about school? What about everything here?" "What's here that we can't leave?" Caleb asked. "We're losing the house anyway. You'll have to change schools regardless." It was true, though saying it out loud made it real in a way that hurt. "But what if the castle is terrible?" Lucy asked. "What if it's scary and cold and full of ghosts?" Caleb knelt down to her level. "Then we come home and figure out something else." "But what if it's not terrible? What if it's the beginning of something wonderful?" "Like Mum used to say," Emma added. "She always said we should never be afraid to try something new." Sarah had said that. She'd believed in taking chances, in the magic of new beginnings. She'd believed that ordinary people could have extraordinary lives if they were brave enough to reach for them. "So we're really doing this?" Michael asked. Caleb looked at the castle deed, still spread across the picnic table, where he'd brought it to show them the land survey. 47 acres. A structure that had stood for over 600 years. A name that belonged to them, that connected them to something larger than their current circumstances. "We're really doing this," he said. The plane tickets cost money they didn't have, charged to a credit card that was already maxed out. But something had shifted in Caleb since making the decision. For the first time in months, he felt like he was moving toward something instead of running away from it. The Hendersons and his siblings could call it foolishness. The neighbors could whisper about the family that had finally cracked under pressure. None of that mattered anymore. They were going to see their castle. The village of Thornwick appeared through the rental car window, like something from a storybook that had been left out in the rain too long. Narrow cobblestone streets wound between stone cottages with thatched roofs, their gardens wild with roses and ivy. A small church with a bell tower stood at the village center, surrounded by shops that looked like they hadn't changed in centuries. But there was something tired about it all. Empty storefronts with "For Let" signs in dusty windows, gardens that were more weeds than flowers, streets that seemed to echo with the footsteps of people who were no longer there. "It's so quiet," Emma whispered from the back seat, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever ghosts lingered in the narrow lanes. Caleb pulled up beside the village pub, the Raven's Rest, its wooden sign creaking in the late afternoon breeze. A few locals sat at outdoor tables, their conversations stopping as they noticed the American strangers peering through car windows. "Are we lost?" Lucy asked, pressing her face against the glass. "I don't think so," Caleb said, checking the directions the solicitor had provided. "The castle should be just up that hill." They drove through the village and up a winding road lined with ancient oak trees. At the crest of the hill, the road opened into a circular drive, and there it was, Blackwood Castle, even more imposing in person than in the photographs. The structure rose from the landscape like something that had grown there rather than been built. Massive stone blocks formed walls that were easily 10 feet thick, punctuated by narrow windows that watched the approach like hooded eyes. One of the 4 corner towers had partially collapsed, its stones scattered across the overgrown courtyard like broken teeth. "It's enormous," Michael breathed, his usual skepticism temporarily forgotten. Caleb parked near what had once been the main entrance and stepped out into the English countryside air. It smelled of rain and roses, of grass that had grown wild and time that had passed slowly. The silence was profound. No traffic, no sirens, no sounds of modern life. Just the wind through the trees and the distant call of actual ravens. The massive wooden door was secured with a chain and padlock, but Jonathan Whitfield had provided keys along with warnings about structural instability. Caleb fumbled with the ancient lock, while his children pressed close behind him, their excitement tempered by the imposing reality of their inheritance. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through centuries. Inside, shafts of late afternoon light streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating a great hall that took Caleb's breath away. The space was vast, easily 40 feet long and 20 feet high, with massive wooden beams supporting what remained of the ceiling. A fireplace large enough to roast an entire pig dominated one wall, its chimney disappearing into shadows above. "This is where knights used to eat," Emma said, her voice hushed with wonder. "And where we could eat too," Lucy added practically, "if we had any food." They explored room by room, their footsteps echoing on stone floors, worn smooth by centuries of use. Most of the furniture was gone, sold off over the years to pay for maintenance. What remained was covered in dust sheets like sleeping ghosts. The kitchen was a maze of stone ovens and copper pots, gone green with age. Upstairs, bedrooms with arrow-slit windows offered views across rolling countryside that stretched to the horizon. "Look at this," Michael called from one of the tower rooms. Caleb climbed the narrow spiral staircase to find his son standing beside a wooden chest filled with old documents and photographs. Michael held up a yellowed newspaper, clipping the Thornwick Chronicle, dated 1943. The headline read, "Blackwood Castle serves as haven for London children during the Blitz." Below was a photograph showing dozens of children playing in the courtyard while adults watched from the castle steps. The story described how Lord Edmund's father had opened the castle to families fleeing the bombing of London, housing over 100 people during the worst of the war. "The Blackwood family has always opened their doors to those in need." The article quoted Lord Blackwood as saying, "These old walls have sheltered many families over the centuries. They can shelter a few more." Emma appeared beside them, having climbed the stairs with Lucy close behind. "We helped people," she said, studying the photograph. "Our family helped save children." It was the first time any of them had said, "our family," in connection with the Blackwoods, and something shifted in the tower room. This wasn't just a building they'd inherited, it was a legacy, a responsibility that stretched back through generations. "Dad," Lucy said, tugging at his jacket, "there are people outside." They looked out the arrow-slit window to see a small group of villagers standing in the courtyard, watching the castle with curious expressions. An elderly woman with silver hair stepped forward as Caleb emerged from the main entrance. "You must be the Americans," she said, her accent crisp and welcoming. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore, village historian and chief busybody. We heard you'd arrived." "Caleb Marsh," he replied, shaking her offered hand. "These are my children, Emma, Michael, and Lucy. Welcome to Thornwick." Eleanor said, then gestured toward the others. "This is Tom Fletcher, our publican. Sarah Chen runs the village shop, and Peter Hartwell manages what's left of our farms." Each villager stepped forward with warm handshakes and welcoming smiles, but Caleb could see the questions in their eyes. Another outsider come to look at the castle, perhaps. Another potential buyer who would disappear once they realized the magnitude of what they'd inherited. "Quite a place you've got here," Tom said, his voice carrying the weight of years spent watching the castle decay. "Been empty since Lord Edmund passed. Shame to see it like this." "We're just visiting," Caleb said quickly. "Just wanted to see what we'd inherited." "Of course," Eleanor said, but her sharp eyes suggested she saw more than he was saying. "Well, if you need anything during your stay, don't hesitate to ask. The village may be small, but we take care of our own." As the villagers departed, Eleanor lingered behind. "Lord Edmund spoke of you, you know," she said quietly. Toward the end, he was quite excited about finding his American relatives. Said the castle had been waiting for the right family to bring it back to life. "I'm not sure we're the right family," Caleb admitted. "I'm not sure anyone could afford what this place needs." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "You'd be surprised what people can accomplish when they have something worth saving. Lord Edmund always said the castle didn't belong to the Blackwoods belonged to the castle." After she left, Caleb stood in the courtyard as darkness settled over the countryside. His children had found a stable area in the great hall and were spreading out their sleeping bags, their voices echoing in the vast space as they planned where they would put furniture, how they would arrange their belongings. The castle was impossible. The restoration costs were astronomical. They had no money, no experience with historical properties, no realistic way to make this work. But as he watched his children claim their space in the ancient hall, as he heard Emma reading to Lucy from a book about castles she'd brought from home, as he saw Michael carefully examining the stone construction with the focused attention he usually reserved for his studies, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced in months. He felt like he was home. The Village Chronicle clipping was still in his pocket, the photograph of children playing in this same courtyard during humanity's darkest hour. The Blackwoods had sheltered people then. Maybe they could do it again. Maybe some things were worth attempting, even when success seemed impossible. Maybe especially then. The first night in the castle was an adventure in medieval discomfort. They'd brought camping gear, but no amount of sleeping bags could soften stone floors that had been cold for centuries. Caleb lay awake, listening to his children's breathing echo in the great hall, to the wind whistling through gaps in the walls, to the settling sounds of a structure that had weathered 600 English winters. But when morning light streamed through the tall windows, painting golden rectangles across the ancient stones, something magical happened. Emma sat up in her sleeping bag, looked around the vast space, and smiled wider than she had since her mother's death. "We really slept in a castle," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might break the spell. They walked to the village for breakfast, finding the Raven's Rest already busy with locals who nodded politely but kept their conversations quiet when the Americans passed. Tom Fletcher served them eggs and bacon, while his wife, Margaret, fussed over the children with the attention of someone who'd raised 4 of her own. "How'd you sleep then?" Tom asked, refilling Caleb's coffee. "Castle can be a bit overwhelming first night." "It was perfect," Lucy announced, her 8-year-old certainty allowing no room for doubt. Eleanor Whitmore appeared at their table with a stack of old books and photographs. "Thought you might like to see some of the castle's history," she said, settling into the empty chair. "I've been the unofficial keeper of village records for 30 years. The Blackwood story is quite remarkable." She opened the first book to reveal photographs spanning decades. The castle in its prime, with manicured gardens and gleaming stonework, wedding parties posed in the great hall, Christmas celebrations with the entire village gathered around enormous decorated trees. "Your family was good to this place," Eleanor explained. "When times were hard, and they often were in villages like this, the Blackwoods found ways to help. During the Depression, they employed half the village on restoration projects. During the war, they took in evacuees. When the mines closed in the 70s, Lord Edmund funded retraining programs." Michael studied a photograph of the castle during a village festival, the courtyard filled with families and children. "What happened? Why did it all stop?" Eleanor's expression grew sad. "Time, mostly, and money. Maintaining a place like this costs more than most people realize. Lord Edmund never married, never had children of his own. Toward the end, he was spending everything he had, just keeping the roof from falling in." She pulled out a bundle of letters tied with ribbon royal correspondence, according to the label. The papers were old but carefully preserved, written in formal script on official letterhead. "These are from various members of the royal family over the years," Eleanor explained, "thanking the Blackwoods for their service, their charitable work, their stewardship of the castle. Your family has quite a distinguished history." Caleb examined one of the letters, dated 1965, praising Lord Edmund's grandfather for his dedication to preserving England's architectural heritage and supporting rural communities in their time of need. "They really were good people," Emma said, looking at a photograph of Lord Edmund as a young man, surrounded by children from the village. "They still are," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes meeting Caleb's. "The question is what you plan to do with that legacy." After breakfast, they returned to the castle with Tom Fletcher and 2 other villagers who'd volunteered to help assess what could be salvaged. The men walked through each room with the practiced eyes of people who'd spent their lives fixing things, pointing out structural issues and potential solutions. Foundations solid, Tom observed, running his hand along the massive stone walls. These old builders knew their craft. Most of the damage is superficial time and weather, not structural failure. The electrical will need complete rewiring, said James Morrison, who'd served as the village electrician for 20 years. But the bones of the system are still there. Someone knew what they were doing when they installed it. They found rooms that were completely intact, a library with built-in shelves reaching to the ceiling, a formal dining room with an enormous oak table that had somehow survived. The tower rooms were in surprisingly good condition, their thick walls having protected them from the worst of the weather. Place has good bones, Tom concluded as they finished their survey. Question is whether you've got the stomach for the work it'll take. That afternoon, while the children explored the grounds under Eleanor's watchful guidance, Caleb called his brother David. The conversation started, predictably. "Please tell me you're calling to say you've come to your senses," David said without preamble. "Actually, I'm calling to say we might stay." The silence stretched long enough that Caleb wondered if the call had dropped. "Stay?" David finally said. "Caleb, that's insane. You don't have money for a project like this. You don't have skills for a project like this. You don't have—" "I don't have anything to lose," Caleb interrupted. "The house is gone anyway. The kids will have to change schools anyway. At least here, we'd be building something instead of just surviving." "Building what? A money pit? A tourist attraction? You're not a businessman, Caleb. You're not an entrepreneur. You're a guy who worked in manufacturing until he got laid off." The dismissal stung, but it also sparked something defensive in Caleb's chest. "Maybe I'm more than that. Maybe I just haven't had the chance to find out. This isn't about finding yourself. This is about providing for your children, Sarah's children." The mention of Sarah hit like a physical blow. "Don't," Caleb said quietly. "Don't what? Don't remind you that your wife wouldn't have wanted you to drag her children halfway around the world on some fantasy adventure." "Sarah believed in possibilities," Caleb said. "She believed that ordinary people could do extraordinary things if they had enough faith and worked hard enough. Sarah was a dreamer. You were supposed to be the practical one." After David hung up, Caleb stood in the castle courtyard, watching his children play among the ancient stones. Emma had found a relatively intact section of wall and was pretending to be a princess looking out over her domain. Lucy was collecting interesting stones and arranging them in patterns. Michael sat reading in the shade, but Caleb noticed he kept looking up to watch his sisters, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When had he last seen them this happy? When had he last seen them this free? Eleanor appeared beside him, following his gaze to the children. "They look like they belong here," she observed. "My family thinks I'm making a terrible mistake." Families often do when someone decides to choose hope over safety. Eleanor studied his profile. "What do you think?" Caleb considered the question seriously. The practical side of his mind, the David side catalogued all the reasons this was impossible. No money, no experience, no guarantee of success. A high probability of spectacular failure. But there was another voice, quieter but more insistent. It sounded like Sarah, like the woman who'd believed that love could conquer logistics, that faith could overcome circumstances. "I think," Caleb said slowly, "that maybe the biggest mistake would be not trying." Eleanor smiled. Lord Edmund would have liked that answer. That evening, as they prepared for their second night in the castle, Marcus Henderson arrived. Caleb heard the rental car in the courtyard and looked out to see his brother-in-law climbing out of a Mercedes, his expensive suit and leather shoes making him look like an alien who'd landed in the wrong century. "Uncle Marcus," Emma called, running to greet him. But Marcus's expression was grim as he approached the castle entrance. "Caleb, we need to talk." The conversation that followed was everything Caleb had expected and dreaded. Marcus stood in the great hall, his voice echoing off the stone walls as he delivered what was clearly a prepared speech about responsibility and reality. "This has gone far enough," Marcus concluded. "You've had your adventure. Now it's time to come home and face your obligations like an adult." "What obligations?" Caleb asked. "To a house I'm losing? To a community that never really accepted us anyway? To providing stability for these children? To honoring Sarah's memory by giving them the life she would have wanted?" "How do you know what Sarah would have wanted?" Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Because she was my sister. Because I loved her too. And because she never would have put her children at risk like this." The accusation hung in the air between them. Behind Marcus, Caleb could see his children watching from the stairs, their faces uncertain. "You're right," Caleb said finally. "Sarah never would have put them at risk. But she also never would have let them settle for less than they deserved, just because it was easier." Marcus shook his head. "This isn't about what they deserve. This is about what's possible. And this," he gestured around the hall, "this isn't possible for someone in your situation." But as Marcus spoke, Caleb found himself really looking at the great hall for the first time since they'd arrived. Not at the damage or the decay, but at the space itself, the magnificent architecture, the sense of permanence and history, the way the light fell through the tall windows, the way his children's voices sounded when they echoed off these ancient walls. Maybe Marcus was right about what was possible, but maybe possible was the wrong question. Maybe the right question was what was worth attempting, regardless of the odds. 3 weeks into their stay, Caleb found himself standing in what had once been the castle's herb garden, holding a stone tablet that Tom Fletcher had unearthed while helping to clear drainage ditches. The carved symbols were worn by centuries of weather, but still visible a series of interconnected circles surrounding what looked like a crown, with dates that made his hands tremble. 1387, Eleanor read over his shoulder, running her finger along the weathered carving. "The year Thomas Blackwood was granted these lands by King Richard II. But look here, these symbols. I've seen them before in the royal archives." The tablet was heavy in Caleb's hands, substantial in a way that made the inheritance feel suddenly real. This wasn't just a property transfer, it was a continuation of something that had begun over 600 years ago. "What do the circles mean?" Emma asked, having appeared at his side with the silent way children had of materializing when something important was happening. "I'm not certain," Eleanor admitted, "but in medieval symbolism, interconnected circles often represented eternal bonds, family, loyalty, service to the crown. The Blackwoods weren't just landowners. They were guardians of something." Marcus had left the day before, his parting words still echoing in Caleb's mind. "When this falls apart, and it wouldn't expect the family to bail you out again." But the stone tablet seemed to argue against Marcus's certainty. Families who kept things for 6 centuries weren't usually the type to let them fall apart. "Dad," Michael called from across the garden, "you need to see this." They followed his voice to a section of the garden wall where he'd been helping Tom clear ivy. Beneath the green curtain, the stones formed a perfect archway, not damaged or collapsed, but deliberately sealed. The mortar was different from the rest of the wall, newer, though still clearly decades old. "Someone walled this up," Tom observed, running his hands along the seam. "Question is why?" Eleanor examined the sealed archway with growing excitement. "This would have led to the old chapel. Lord Edmund's father sealed it in the 1950s after the roof collapsed. Said it was dangerous, but I always wondered if there was more to it." "Can we open it?" Lucy asked, with the directness of an 8-year-old who saw solutions where adults saw problems. Tom and Caleb exchanged glances. The practical answer was no. They had no idea what lay beyond the seal, no guarantee it was safe, no business disturbing what previous generations had chosen to close off. But there was something about the archway that called to them. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light fell across the stones, or the feeling that they were meant to discover whatever lay beyond. Maybe it was simply that Caleb was tired of accepting other people's decisions about what was possible. "We'll need proper equipment," Tom said finally, "and probably some help from the lads." By evening, half the village had gathered to watch Tom and 3 other men carefully remove the newer stones from the archway. The work was delicate. These walls had stood for centuries, and one wrong move could bring down more than anyone intended. As the last stone came free, they peered into darkness that smelled of age and secrets. Tom's flashlight beam revealed a narrow passage leading deeper into the castle's foundation than any of them had realized existed. "I'm not sure we should," Caleb began, but Emma was already squeezing through the gap. "It's safe, Dad," her voice echoed from within. "There's another room." One by one, they followed her through the passage and into a space that took their breath away. It was a small chapel, perfectly preserved by the sealed entrance. Stained glass windows, filtered colored light across stone walls, covered in carved symbols. At the altar stood a wooden cross that looked as old as the castle itself. But it was what surrounded the altar that made Eleanor gasp. Stone pedestals lined the chapel walls, each bearing carved plaques with dates and symbols. But the pedestals were empty, whatever they'd once held was gone. "This was a treasury," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Look at the craftsmanship, the attention to detail. The Blackwoods weren't just keeping family artifacts here. They were protecting something important." Michael found a carved stone panel beside the altar, its surface covered in the same interconnected circles they'd seen on the garden tablet. But these were more elaborate, more detailed, surrounding what was clearly a royal coat of arms. "Why would they seal it up?" Emma asked, running her fingers along one of the empty pedestals. "Maybe to protect it," Caleb said quietly. "Maybe they knew hard times were coming and wanted to keep it safe until the right moment." As they emerged from the chapel, the villagers who'd gathered to watch were buzzing with excitement. Word of the discovery spread through Thornwick faster than wildfire, and by the next morning, Caleb found himself fielding calls from historians, archaeologists, and treasure hunters. But it was the call from Richard Henderson that turned his blood cold. "What's this I hear about you digging around in some old chapel?" Richard's voice carried the sharp edge of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Marcus told me you've completely lost your mind, but I thought he was exaggerating. We found a sealed chapel. Eleanor thinks it might have historical significance." "Historical significance?" Richard's laugh was bitter. "Caleb, you're about to lose your house. Your children are sleeping on stone floors in a foreign country, and you're playing archaeologist. Maybe I'm learning something about my family's history." "Your family's history is in Ohio. Your family's history is Sarah, and those 3 children who need their father to stop chasing fantasies and start making practical decisions." After Richard hung up, Caleb found himself back in the chapel, staring at the empty pedestals. What had been here? What had been important enough to hide away, to protect behind sealed stones and forgotten passages? Eleanor appeared beside him, having climbed through the passage with the ease of someone half her age. "I've been thinking about the symbols," she said, settling onto one of the stone benches. "The interconnected circles, the royal connection. There's something familiar about the pattern, but I can't quite place it." "Does it matter?" Caleb asked. "Whatever was here is gone now." "Maybe. Or maybe it's just hidden better than we thought." Eleanor studied the carved panel beside the altar. "The Blackwoods were clever people, Caleb. They survived civil wars, plagues, political upheavals. They knew how to protect what mattered." That evening, as they prepared for another night in the Great Hall, Caleb overheard his children talking in the corner where they'd arranged their sleeping bags. "Do you think we'll have to go back?" Lucy asked, her voice small with worry. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "Dad seems different here, happier, but Uncle Marcus and Grandfather Richard want us to come home." "This feels like home," Emma said firmly. "More than the old house ever did." The conversation pierced Caleb's heart. Emma was right. Something about the castle felt like home in a way their house in Ohio never had. Maybe it was the sense of history, of belonging to something larger than themselves. Maybe it was the way the villagers had welcomed them, not as outsiders, but as the return of something they'd been waiting for. Or maybe it was simply that for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt like he was building something instead of just surviving. But building required resources they didn't have, skills he wasn't sure he possessed, and faith that his family would eventually understand what he was trying to do. The stone tablet sat on the mantelpiece where he'd placed it, its carved symbols seeming to watch over the great hall like ancient guardians. The interconnected circles caught the firelight, reminding him that some bonds were meant to last for centuries. The question was whether he had the courage to honor those bonds, even when everyone he trusted was telling him to walk away. Outside, the English countryside settled into its quiet night rhythms. Inside the castle, 4 Americans lay on sleeping bags spread across floors that had sheltered Blackwoods for 25 generations. And somewhere in the walls around them, secrets waited to be discovered by those brave enough to look. The Blackwood family ring appeared on a Tuesday morning, discovered by Lucy while she was helping Eleanor tend the castle's herb garden. The 8-year-old's excited shouts brought everyone running to find her holding a tarnished silver signet ring, its surface bearing the same interconnected circles they'd found carved throughout the castle. "It was just sitting there in the dirt," Lucy explained, her eyes bright with discovery. "Like it was waiting for us to find it." Eleanor examined the ring with trembling hands, her historian's training warring with her excitement. "This is extraordinary," she whispered. "Look at the craftsmanship, the detail in the carving. This isn't just jewelry, it's a seal of office." The ring was too large for any of them to wear, clearly made for a man's hand. But when Caleb slipped it onto his finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 6 centuries for exactly this moment. "Try it on the wax," Emma suggested, having read enough adventure stories to understand the significance of signet rings. Eleanor produced a candle and some sealing wax from her seemingly endless supply of historical materials. When Caleb pressed the ring into the warm wax, it left a perfect impression, the interconnected circles surrounding a crown, with symbols along the border that Eleanor couldn't immediately identify. "I need to compare this to the Royal Archives," she said, photographing the wax impression from multiple angles. "These border symbols, they're not just decorative. They're a code." As Eleanor hurried off to her research, Caleb found himself staring at the ring on his finger. It felt substantial, meaningful, in a way that went beyond its obvious historical value. For the first time since inheriting the castle, he felt like he might actually belong here. That feeling lasted exactly 3 hours, until his sister Rebecca called. "I just got off the phone with Richard Henderson," she said without preamble. "He's talking about filing for custody of the children." The words hit Caleb like physical blows. "What?" "He says you've abandoned all sense of responsibility, that you're dragging those kids around Europe while living in unsafe conditions, chasing fantasies instead of providing proper care." Caleb sank into one of the chairs Tom Fletcher had helped him repair. Through the great hall's windows, he could see his children playing in the courtyard, their laughter echoing off the ancient stones. "They're happy here, Rebecca, happier than they've been since Sarah died." "Happy doesn't matter if they're not safe. Richard has lawyers, Caleb. He has money and influence and a very compelling case about an unstable father making irrational decisions." "What kind of case?" Rebecca's sigh carried across the ocean. "Unemployment, financial instability, sudden relocation to a foreign country. Housing them in a structurally unsound historical building without proper utilities or safety measures. It writes itself." After Rebecca hung up, Caleb sat in the growing darkness of the great hall, the family ring heavy on his finger. Everything his sister had said was true. By any conventional measure, he was failing as a father. He'd brought his children to a crumbling castle in a foreign country with no plan, no resources, and no realistic hope of success. But as he watched them through the window, Emma teaching Lucy to identify different types of stones, Michael reading to both of them from a book about medieval history, he couldn't bring himself to believe he was wrong. Eleanor returned near midnight, her arms full of old books and her eyes bright with discovery. "The symbols on the ring," she said without preamble. "I found them. They're not just decorative, they're a map." She spread photocopies across the great hall's massive table, pointing to various documents and diagrams. These border symbols correspond to locations throughout the castle and grounds. "Look, this one matches the carving above the main entrance. This one is identical to the stone we found in the herb garden." Caleb leaned forward, studying the papers. "A map to what?" "I don't know yet, but I found something else." Eleanor pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. Lord Edmund's private diary. He mentions the ring specifically. She opened to a marked page and read aloud. The family ring holds the key to our greatest responsibility. Each generation must decide whether they are worthy of the trust placed in them by those who came before. The symbols will guide the worthy to what has been hidden, but only when the need is great and the heart is pure. Hidden where? Emma asked, having appeared at Caleb's shoulder with the silent way children had of materializing during important conversations. Eleanor smiled. That's what we need to figure out. The next few days blurred together as they systematically examined every location marked by the ring's symbols. The carving above the main entrance revealed a hidden compartment containing more old documents. The symbol in the herb garden led them to a loose stone that hid a small cache of medieval coins. But it was Michael who made the breakthrough. "Dad," he called from the library tower, "I think I found something." They climbed the spiral staircase to find him standing before a bookshelf that looked identical to all the others, except for one detail carved into the top shelf, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it, was one of the ring's symbols. "I was organizing the books Eleanor brought from the village," Michael explained, "and I noticed this shelf was shallower than the others." Together, they pulled the books away to reveal that the back of the shelf was actually a wooden panel. When Caleb pressed the ring symbol, the panel slid aside with a soft click. Behind it was a narrow space containing a metal strongbox. The box was heavy, clearly old, and locked with a mechanism that none of them recognized. But when Caleb pressed his ring against a small indentation in the lock, it opened with a sound like a sigh. Inside were documents that made Eleanor gasp: parchments bearing royal seals, certificates written in Latin, and maps showing landholdings that stretched far beyond the castle grounds. At the bottom of the box was a letter addressed to the future Lord of Blackwood Castle in Lord Edmund's careful handwriting. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice growing more amazed with each word. "To my American cousin, if you are reading this, then the ring has judged you worthy, and the symbols have guided you true. What you hold in your hands is the documentation of a trust established by King Richard II in 1387, granting the Blackwood family stewardship over crown lands in perpetuity. The trust was sealed during World War II to protect it from potential seizure and has remained dormant for over 80 years. The current value of the holdings, invested and managed by the Crown Estate, is approximately £300 million. But money is not the true treasure. The real inheritance is the responsibility that comes with it, to use this wealth for the betterment of the communities under your care, as your ancestors have done for over 6 centuries. You will face those who do not understand, who will call you foolish for believing in something larger than immediate comfort. But if you have found this letter, then you have already proven you possess the faith necessary to be a true Blackwood. The ring chose you. Trust that choice, as I have trusted it to guide you to what you need most." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Lucy's amazed whisper, "We're really rich." But Caleb barely heard her. His hands were shaking as he held documents that represented more money than he'd ever imagined, more security than his family had ever known. The solution to every problem they faced, the answer to every doubt his relatives had raised. "There's more," Eleanor said softly, pulling out a final document. "Instructions for claiming the trust. It requires formal presentation to the Crown Estate Office in London, with proof of lineage and authentication of the family seal." As the implications sank in, Caleb felt a strange mixture of joy and terror. The money would change, everything would give his children opportunities he'd never dreamed of, would allow him to restore the castle properly, would prove to Richard Henderson and everyone else that he hadn't been chasing fantasies after all. But it would also make them targets. Word of a discovery like this wouldn't stay secret long, and there would be others who would claim they deserved a share of something that had been hidden for so long. "What do we do now?" Emma asked, looking at the documents with wide eyes. Caleb thought of Richard Henderson's threats about custody, of his siblings' certainty that he was failing his children, of all the people who'd dismissed him as a dreamer with no grasp of reality. "Now," he said, slipping the ring off his finger and looking at its familiar weight, "now we find out if we're really worthy of what our family trusted us to protect." Outside, the English countryside settled into twilight, unaware that the little American family camping in the castle had just discovered they were heirs to one of the largest fortunes in England. And somewhere, in offices across the ocean, phones were already beginning to ring as word of their discovery started to spread. The Royal Trust document changed everything, but not in the way Caleb had expected. Eleanor had insisted on taking the discovery to London immediately, to the Crown Estate Office, where such claims were evaluated. The building was imposing, all marble columns and brass plaques that spoke of centuries of British institutional authority. The clerk who received them, a thin man named Pemberton, with silver hair and careful eyes, examined the documents with the solemnity of someone handling archaeological treasures. "Extraordinary," he murmured, studying the medieval parchments through a magnifying glass. "These appear to be authentic 13th century grants. The seals are correct, the Latin is proper for the period, and the Crown Estate has records of the Blackwood Trust being sealed in 1943. He looked up at Caleb with something approaching awe. "Mr. Marsh, if these documents are verified and our preliminary examination suggests they will be, you are the heir to one of the oldest continuous trusts in English history." The authentication process took 3 days. 3 days during which Caleb and his children stayed in a London hotel that cost more per night than they'd spent on food in a month back home. 3 days of interviews with historians, examinations by document experts, and calls to verify genealogical records that stretched back 6 centuries. And 3 days during which word of their discovery spread through channels Caleb hadn't even known existed. The first sign of trouble came when they returned to Thornwick to find a cluster of expensive cars parked in the village square. "Reporters," Eleanor explained grimly. Someone had leaked news of the trust claim to the press, and now the quiet countryside village was crawling with journalists, hungry for the story of the American family who'd inherited a fortune. But the reporters were nothing compared to what waited at the castle. Marcus Henderson stood in the great hall like he owned it, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who had the sharp-eyed look of attorneys. Behind them, looking uncomfortable but determined, were Caleb's siblings David and Rebecca, who'd apparently flown to England the moment they'd heard about the trust. "There he is," Marcus announced as Caleb entered with his children. "The man who thinks he can claim £300 million because he found some old papers in a wall." "Marcus," Caleb said carefully, "what are you doing here?" "Protecting my nieces and nephew from a father who's clearly lost all sense of reality," Marcus replied. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The media attention, the security risks, the legal complications." One of the lawyers stepped forward, extending a business card. "James Patterson, Patterson, Associates. We represent the Henderson family's interests in this matter." "What interests?" Caleb asked. "This has nothing to do with the Hendersons." "Actually, it has everything to do with us," David interjected, his lawyer's training evident in his measured tone. "Those children are American citizens. Sarah was an American citizen. Any inheritance they receive is subject to American tax law, estate regulations, and family court jurisdiction." Rebecca moved closer to the children, her voice gentle but firm. "Emma, Michael, Lucy, why don't you come with Aunt Rebecca while the grown-ups talk?" "We want to stay with Dad," Emma said, moving protectively closer to Caleb. But Michael was studying the lawyers with the sharp intelligence he'd inherited from his mother. "They're here to take us away, aren't they?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Marcus stepped forward, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable. "Caleb, be practical. This trust, if it's even real, comes with responsibilities you can't handle. Tax obligations, legal requirements, public scrutiny. These children need stability, not chaos." "They need their father," Caleb said quietly. Do they? David's question hung in the air like smoke. Look around, Caleb. You're camping in a ruin, chasing medieval fantasies while your children sleep on stone floors. The courts will see exactly what we see: a man who's lost all perspective. The second lawyer produced a thick folder of documents. We've filed preliminary custody papers in Ohio, he announced. Given the father's unstable living situation and questionable decision-making, we believe the children would be better served in a more structured environment. With us, Rebecca added gently, where they can have proper schools, proper homes, proper futures. Eleanor, who had been quietly observing from the castle entrance, finally spoke. And the trust? What happens to £300 million that legally belongs to these children? Marcus's smile was cold. The trust will be managed by responsible adults until the children come of age. Properly invested, properly protected, properly administered by people who understand financial management. People like you, Caleb said, understanding dawning like a dark sunrise. People who have the children's best interests at heart, David corrected. People who won't drag them around Europe on some romantic notion about family history. Caleb looked at his children, Emma's frightened eyes, Michael's angry defiance, Lucy's confusion at the tension crackling through the great hall. Then he looked at the family ring on his finger, its symbols catching the afternoon light, streaming through the tall windows. "Get out," he said quietly. "Caleb," Rebecca began. "Get out of my castle, all of you." Marcus laughed. "Your castle? Caleb, you can't afford the property taxes on this place. You can't afford to maintain it. You can't even afford proper housing for your children. What makes you think you can handle a £300 million trust?" But Caleb was no longer the man who'd sat quietly in his Ohio kitchen, accepting defeats and disappointments as inevitable. Something had changed during his weeks in England, something that went deeper than discovering hidden wealth or ancient family secrets. "Because it's mine," he said, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Because those symbols chose me. Because that ring fits my finger. Because for the first time in my life I'm standing in a place where I belong." He looked directly at Marcus, then at his siblings. "You've spent years telling me what I can't do, what I'm not capable of, what I don't deserve. But you're wrong. Maybe I was the safe choice, the practical choice, the man who kept his head down and never reached for anything extraordinary. But Sarah didn't marry safe. She married someone she believed could be extraordinary when the moment demanded it." David's expression softened slightly. "Caleb, we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to protect those children." "From what?" "From a father who loves them, from a life that offers them something bigger than suburban mediocrity. From learning that they come from a family that spent 6 centuries protecting something valuable enough to hide for generations. From poverty," Marcus said bluntly. "From instability, from a father who's so lost in fantasy that he can't see reality." "Reality?" Caleb gestured around the great hall, at the ancient stones and soaring arches that had sheltered his family for 25 generations. "This is reality. That trust is reality. The fact that my children are heirs to something extraordinary, that's reality." The lawyers exchanged glances, clearly calculating their next move. Patterson stepped forward with the careful manner of someone delivering bad news. "Mr. Marsh, the custody papers have been filed. The children will need to return to the United States pending resolution of their living situation. The trust claim can proceed, but the children's welfare takes precedence." "Over my dead body," Caleb said. "Dad," Michael said quietly, moving to stand beside him. "We don't want to go back. This is our home now." Emma and Lucy flanked their father, creating a family unit that faced the lawyers and relatives with unified determination. "The courts will decide what's best for the children," Patterson said, "not their emotional attachments to inappropriate living situations." But as the lawyers prepared to serve their papers, Eleanor cleared her throat from the doorway. "I'm afraid there's been a development," she said calmly. "The Crown Estate has completed their authentication. The Blackwood Trust is verified, legitimate, and active." As of this morning, Mr. Marsh is officially the trustee of one of England's oldest charitable foundations. She smiled at the stunned faces around the Great Hall, which means, legally speaking, he's no longer unemployed, financially unstable, or unable to provide for his children. He's the administrator of a £300 million trust, with all the legal protections and social standing that entails. Marcus was the first to recover. A trust that can be challenged, a fortune that comes with obligations he can't meet. Perhaps, Eleanor agreed, but those challenges will be heard in English courts, under English law, regarding English property and English trusts. The American custody filing has no jurisdiction here. She turned to Caleb with her expression of quiet triumph. Congratulations, Lord Blackwood. Your family has been waiting 6 centuries for you to come home. The title hung in the air like a thunderclap. Lord Blackwood, not Caleb Marsh, the unemployed manufacturing worker from Ohio, not the failure his family had always seen him as, but Lord Blackwood, heir to a name that had been spoken with respect in English corridors of power for over 600 years. The lawyers were already on their phones, clearly regrouping for a more complex legal battle. Marcus stood frozen, his certainty cracking like ice in spring sun. David and Rebecca exchanged worried glances, understanding that the game had just changed completely. But Caleb barely noticed any of them. He was looking at his children, seeing wonder and pride replace the fear that had filled their faces moments before. "Are you really a lord now, Dad?" Lucy asked with 8-year-old directness. Caleb looked at the family ring, at the ancient stones surrounding them, at the future that stretched ahead like an undiscovered country. "I suppose I am," he said. And somewhere in the walls around them, 6 centuries of Blackwood ancestors seemed to approve. The authentication certificate arrived on a grey London morning, delivered by courier to the offices of Whitfield, Pemberton, associates in a ceremony that felt more like a coronation than a legal proceeding. Caleb held the document thick parchment with gold seals and ribbon that declared him the verified and legitimate heir to the Blackwood trust stand, wondered how his life had become something requiring official authentication. "This makes it real," Jonathan Whitfield explained, his British accent lending gravity to every word. "The Crown Estate has verified your lineage, authenticated the historical documents, and confirmed the trust's validity. You are now, legally and officially, Lord Caleb Blackwood, trustee of the Blackwood Charitable Foundation." But even as Caleb should have been celebrating, darker forces were gathering. The Henderson family had not accepted defeat gracefully. Richard had retained the most expensive legal firm in London, flooding the courts with challenges that ranged from the reasonable to the absurd. They questioned Caleb's mental competency, his ability to manage such wealth, his fitness as a parent, and even his right to use the Blackwood name. "They're trying to bury us in legal fees," Eleanor explained as they sat in the castle's library, surrounded by stacks of court documents. "Even if we win every challenge, the cost of fighting them could bankrupt the trust before you ever gain control of it." David and Rebecca had joined the legal assault, their betrayal cutting deeper than Marcus's predictable greed. His own siblings were arguing in court papers that their brother was mentally unstable, that his children were at risk, that the entire inheritance was a delusion that proved his disconnect from reality. "Listen to this," Eleanor said, reading from the latest filing. "The defendant has abandoned all reasonable behavior, dragging his minor children to a foreign country to live in unsafe conditions while pursuing fantasies of aristocratic inheritance. His actions demonstrate a complete break from rational decision-making and pose an immediate danger to his children's welfare." Michael, now enrolled in the village school but spending his afternoons helping with the legal research, looked up from his homework. "They really think we're in danger here?" Caleb looked around the library walls lined with books collected over centuries, windows offering views of countryside that had remained unchanged for generations, the warm glow of lamplight on ancient stones. His children were healthier, happier, and more engaged with learning than they'd ever been in Ohio. "They think we're in danger of being happy," he said quietly. The legal challenges were just the beginning. Word of the Blackwood Trust had spread through international financial circles, attracting attention from people who made Marcus Henderson look like an amateur. A consortium of investors had appeared, claiming they held liens against the castle from previous owners. A group calling itself the Blackwood Heritage Foundation emerged, insisting they were the legitimate caretakers of the family legacy. Most troubling was the appearance of James Blackwood, a distant cousin from Australia who claimed his great-grandfather had been cheated out of his inheritance in the 1920s. His lawyers argued that the trust should be divided among all living Blackwood descendants, not concentrated in the hands of one American branch of the family. "The hearing is set for next month," Eleanor explained, spreading court schedules across the library table. "London High Court. Every challenge will be heard at once. Custody, legitimacy, financial competency, even the validity of the trust itself." "What are our chances?" Caleb asked. Eleanor's pause was answer enough. Tom Fletcher had become their unexpected strategic advisor, his practical wisdom proving invaluable as they prepared for legal battle. "The way I see it," he said over dinner at the Raven's Rest, "they're trying to overwhelm you with numbers. Multiple challenges, multiple lawyers, multiple angles of attack. But that's also their weakness." "How do you mean?" Caleb asked. "They can't all be right. If you're mentally incompetent, then how did you successfully navigate the authentication process? If the trust is invalid, then why are they fighting so hard to control it? If the children are in danger, then why do they look healthier and happier than they have in months?" Emma looked up from her shepherd's pie. "We do look better, don't we, Dad? Michael's not having nightmares anymore, and Lucy hasn't asked about when we're going home in weeks." It was true. The constant stress that had marked their final months in Ohio had melted away in the English countryside. The children slept deeply, woke eagerly, and spent their days exploring, learning, and laughing in ways Caleb had feared he might never see again. But the legal pressure was taking its toll on him. He'd lost weight, was sleeping poorly, and found himself constantly checking over his shoulder for new threats. The Blackwood ring, once a source of strength, now felt heavy with the weight of centuries of responsibility. "There's something else," Eleanor said quietly. "I've been researching the other claimants, trying to understand their motivations. James Blackwood's case isn't as strong as his lawyers claim. The records from the 1920s show his great-grandfather was compensated for relinquishing his claim. The investment consortium's liens are questionable at best, but Marcus Henderson—" She paused, clearly uncomfortable with what she'd discovered. "What about Marcus?" Caleb asked. "He's been in contact with property developers. There are plans preliminary, but detailed to convert the castle into a luxury resort. The kind of development that would destroy everything that makes this place special." The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just fighting for control of the trust, was planning to commercialize it, to turn 6 centuries of family history into a profit center for wealthy tourists. "Over my dead body," Caleb said, his voice carrying a steel that surprised everyone at the table. "That might be what it takes," Tom replied grimly. "This hearing isn't just about money or custody. It's about what kind of people get to control places like this. Whether history belongs to those who inherited it or those who can afford to buy it." That night, as his children slept in the great hall now, furnished with proper beds and heating thanks to the trust's preliminary funds, Caleb walked the castle walls alone. The English countryside stretched out below him, peaceful under starlight, but he felt like a man under siege. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "It's not too late to find a compromise. Think about what Sarah would want." But Caleb knew exactly what Sarah would want. She'd want their children to grow up believing they could overcome any obstacle, that love and determination could triumph over money and influence, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when they refused to give up. She'd want them to fight. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Eleanor arrived at the castle before breakfast, her face grim with purpose. "I found something," she announced, spreading photocopies across the kitchen table. I've been researching the legal precedents for trust challenges, and I discovered a case from 1987. Another American heir, another ancient English trust, another family trying to seize control through the courts. She pointed to a legal document that made Caleb's heart race. The Pemberton Trust case. Same legal arguments, same types of challenges, and look at the outcome. Caleb read the summary with growing amazement. The American heir had successfully defended his inheritance against family challenges, but only after proving he understood the historical significance of what he'd inherited and demonstrated his commitment to preserving it for future generations. The judge ruled that trusts like this aren't just about money, Eleanor explained. They're about stewardship. The heir who wins is the one who proves they'll honor the original intent of the trust to benefit the community and preserve the heritage. How do we prove that? Michael asked, having appeared with his usual silent way of materializing during important conversations. Eleanor smiled. By showing the court what you've already done. The castle restoration, the community involvement, the way the village has responded to your presence. By proving that you're not here to cash out, you're here to continue a legacy. The realization dawned slowly. The legal battle wasn't just about defending their right to the inheritance, it was about proving they deserved it. That they understood what it meant to be Blackwoods, what it meant to be guardians of something larger than themselves. We need character witnesses, Caleb said. People who can testify about our intentions, our character, our commitment to the community. We need more than that, Eleanor replied. We need to show the court a concrete plan. How you intend to use the trust, how you'll preserve the castle, how you'll benefit the community. We need to prove that giving you control isn't just legally correct, it's morally right. As they prepared for the battle ahead, Caleb felt something shift inside him. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued him since the legal challenges began was replaced by a calm determination. This wasn't about money anymore, or even about keeping his children. This was about proving he was worthy of the trust his ancestors had placed in him. The hearing was 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare a case that would determine not just their financial future, but their right to call themselves Blackwoods. 3 weeks to prove that some things were more important than legal technicalities or family politics. 3 weeks to show the world that a man who'd been dismissed as a failure his entire life could be exactly the guardian this ancient trust needed. The Blackwood ring caught the morning light as Caleb slipped it onto his finger, its familiar weight now feeling less like a burden and more like armor. Let them come, he thought, all of them. The Hendersons with their lawyers, his siblings with their betrayal, the distant relatives with their claims, the developers with their plans. They would discover what 6 centuries of Blackwoods already knew. Some things were worth fighting for, no matter the odds. The court summons arrived on official letterhead that made the stakes brutally clear. The High Court of Justice, Chancery Division, in the matter of the Blackwood Trust succession. Every legal challenge, every family betrayal, every question about Caleb's fitness as both father and heir would be decided in a single hearing that would determine his family's future. The Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand felt like a cathedral built to worship the law itself. Caleb walked through its Gothic arches with Eleanor beside him, his children having remained at the castle under Tom Fletcher's protection. The marble halls echoed with the footsteps of centuries of legal proceedings, and Caleb wondered how many other ordinary men had stood where he stood, fighting for something that meant more than money. Remember, Eleanor whispered as they approached the courtroom, this isn't about convincing them you deserve the inheritance, it's about proving you understand what it means to be worthy of it. Inside, the courtroom was already filled. Marcus Henderson sat with his legal team, his expression confident in the way of a man accustomed to winning. David and Rebecca flanked him, their faces carefully neutral but their presence speaking volumes about where their loyalties lay. Behind them sat James Blackwood, the Australian cousin whose own claim had brought him halfway around the world, to challenge Caleb's right to their shared name. But it was the man in the front row who made Caleb's blood run cold, Richard Henderson himself, Sarah's father, who had flown from Ohio to testify against his own son-in-law's fitness as a parent. Justice Margaret Thornley entered with the bearing of someone who had spent decades separating truth from legal fiction. She was younger than Caleb had expected, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who would not be swayed by eloquent arguments that lacked substance. "This is an unusual case," she began, her voice carrying easily through the ornate courtroom. "We have multiple challenges to a verified inheritance, questions of competency, legitimacy, and the best interests of minor children. But at its heart, this case is about something deeper. Whether the defendant understands the true nature of what he has inherited, and whether he can be trusted to honor the obligations that come with it." Marcus's lawyer, Patterson, rose first with the polished confidence of expensive legal representation. His argument was methodical, devastating, and brutally personal. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear. Caleb Marsh is a man whose judgment has been compromised by desperation and fantasy. After losing his employment and facing foreclosure, he abandoned rational decision-making in favor of a delusional belief that he could transform his family's circumstances through inheritance of a medieval property he cannot afford to maintain." Patterson gestured toward a stack of evidence that seemed to chronicle every mistake Caleb had made since Sarah's death. "The defendant has removed his children from stable housing, reliable education, and family support systems to pursue what can only be described as a romantic delusion about aristocratic inheritance. He has housed them in a structurally unsound historical building, exposed them to international media attention, and created a situation where their basic welfare depends on legal proceedings they are too young to understand." The lawyer's voice took on a tone of practiced sympathy. "This is not about greed, Your Honor. This is about protecting 3 children from a father whose love for them has been clouded by judgment, compromised by grief, financial desperation, and an inability to distinguish between fairy tale and reality." Richard Henderson was called as the first witness, and his testimony was like watching a careful execution. Sarah's father spoke with the measured authority of a successful businessman, painting a picture of Caleb as a man who had always been dependent on others' support, who had never shown the leadership or business acumen necessary to manage significant wealth. "My daughter loved him," Richard said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine sorrow. "But love isn't always enough. Sarah was the dreamer in that relationship. Caleb was supposed to be the practical one, the anchor that kept her dreams grounded in reality. Instead, after her death, he seems to have inherited her tendency toward fantasy without any of her strength or wisdom." The words cut deeper because they contained elements of truth. Caleb had been the practical one, the steady provider who worked his shifts and paid his bills and never reached for anything extraordinary, until now. David's testimony was even more damaging because it came wrapped in the language of brotherly concern. "I've watched my brother struggle since Sarah's death," he said, his lawyer's training evident in every carefully chosen word. "The man sitting in this courtroom isn't the Caleb I grew up with. That man would never have uprooted his children on such a fantastical venture. That man understood the difference between hope and delusion." But it was Rebecca's testimony that nearly broke Caleb's resolve. His sister took the witness stand with tears in her eyes, speaking about her love for Emma, Michael, and Lucy, her concern for their welfare, her belief that their father's judgment had been compromised by grief and desperation. "Those children have been through so much," she said, her voice breaking with what seemed like genuine emotion. "They lost their mother, their home, their entire sense of security. They deserve better than to be dragged around Europe while their father chases medieval fantasies. They deserve the chance to heal, to rebuild their lives in a stable environment, surrounded by family who can provide for their needs." As witness after witness testified to Caleb's unfitness, Eleanor squeezed his hand under the table. "Your turn is coming," she whispered. "Trust the truth." When Justice Thornley called for the defense to present their case, Eleanor rose with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent her life studying history and understood that truth had a way of surviving even the most sophisticated attacks. "Your Honor," she began. The plaintiffs would have this court believe that love, faith, and the courage to reach for something extraordinary are signs of mental incompetence. They argue that a father who chooses hope over surrender, who refuses to accept defeat as inevitable, is somehow unfit to care for his children or manage an inheritance his ancestors spent 6 centuries preserving for exactly this moment. She gestured toward Caleb, and for the first time since the hearing began, he felt someone in that courtroom truly seeing him. Caleb Marsh didn't abandon rational decision-making when he brought his children to England. He made the most rational decision possible for a man in his circumstances, chose to build something instead of merely surviving the destruction of everything he'd worked for. He chose to give his children a connection to something larger than their immediate circumstances. He chose to honor the faith of ancestors who preserved this trust through wars, depressions, and centuries of change, because they believed future generations would prove worthy of it. Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each word, filling the courtroom with the kind of conviction that couldn't be manufactured by legal training. The plaintiffs speak of fantasy and delusion, but what is truly fantastical believing that ordinary people can rise to meet extraordinary circumstances, or believing that wealth and legal maneuvering automatically confer the wisdom to manage a legacy built on 6 centuries of service to community and crown? As Eleanor continued her opening statement, Caleb felt something shift in the courtroom's atmosphere. The judge leaned forward slightly, her expression more attentive. Even some of the opposing lawyers seemed to be listening with genuine interest, rather than simply waiting for their turn to object. But the real test would come when Caleb himself took the witness stand, when he would have to find words to explain choices that had been driven more by faith than logic, more by love than strategy. The man who had spent his life avoiding confrontation, who had always chosen the safe path over the uncertain one, would now have to convince one of England's highest courts that he possessed the courage and wisdom to be worthy of a trust his family had protected for 25 generations. Everything depended on whether he could find the strength to be the man Sarah had always believed he could become. The final judgment began not with legal pronouncements, but with Caleb Marsh taking the witness stand in a London courtroom where 6 centuries of his family's legacy hung in the balance. "State your name for the record," Justice Thornley instructed. "Caleb Marsh," he replied, then paused. The courtroom was silent, waiting. Caleb Blackwood Marsh. It was the first time he'd spoken his full name aloud in legal proceedings, and something about the sound of it, the way it connected him to generations of men who had stood in other courtrooms, faced other challenges, made other choices that echoed through. Time gave him strength he hadn't known he possessed. Patterson, Marcus's lawyer, approached with the predatory confidence of a man about to deliver a killing blow. "Mr. Marsh, you were unemployed when you received notice of this inheritance, correct?" "Yes." "Facing foreclosure on your home?" "Yes." "With 3 dependent children and no apparent means of supporting them?" "That's correct." Patterson smiled, sensing victory. "So when you received a letter about inheriting a castle in England, you saw it as what a miraculous solution to all your problems." Caleb considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, he would have given the safe answer, the answer that wouldn't draw attention or invite conflict. But the man who had discovered hidden chapels and ancient trusts, who had worn his ancestors' ring and felt the weight of centuries of responsibility, was no longer that man. "No," he said quietly. "I saw it as a chance to give my children something I'd never been able to provide, a sense of belonging to something larger than our immediate circumstances. Belonging to a crumbling medieval castle with no heat, no proper plumbing, and no realistic means of restoration. Belonging to a family legacy that has survived 600 years because every generation found the courage to preserve it for the next one." Patterson's expression sharpened. "Mr. Marsh, isn't it true that you have no experience managing large sums of money, no business background, no qualifications that would suggest you're capable of administering a £300 million trust?" "That's true. Then why should this court believe you're competent to handle such responsibility?" Caleb looked across the courtroom at his family, at Marcus with his calculating eyes, at David and Rebecca with their well-meaning betrayal. At Richard Henderson, whose disapproval had shadowed every family gathering for 15 years. Then he looked at Eleanor, whose faith in him had never wavered, and felt the weight of the Blackwood ring on his finger. Because, he said, his voice growing stronger, competence isn't just about experience or education. It's about understanding what you're responsible for and being willing to sacrifice for it. The Blackwood Trust isn't just money, it's a commitment to preserve something meaningful, to support communities, to honor the faith of people who gave up everything to keep this legacy alive. He turned to face Justice Thornley directly. I may not have business experience, but I understand something about loss, about fighting to protect what matters most, about choosing to build instead of just survive. Patterson pressed on, his questions designed to expose every doubt, every moment of uncertainty, every practical limitation that made Caleb's claim seem impossible. But with each attack, Caleb felt more certain of his ground. Your children have been removed from their schools, their friends, their extended family support system. How is that in their best interests? My children are healthier and happier than they've been since their mother died, Caleb replied. They're learning about their heritage, discovering they're part of something that has meaning beyond immediate comfort. They're sleeping through the night, for the first time, in months. In a medieval castle without proper heating, in a home where they feel they belong. Justice Thornley leaned forward. Mr. Marsh, the court has heard extensive testimony about your supposed unfitness as a guardian and administrator, but I'd like to hear your own assessment. Do you believe you're qualified to manage this trust? The question hung in the courtroom air like incense. Caleb felt the attention of everyone present, felt the weight of his ancestors' expectations, felt the future of his children balanced on his next words. 6 months ago, I would have said no, he answered honestly. 6 months ago, I was a man who had accepted that extraordinary things happened to other people, that my job was to keep my head down and be grateful for whatever life gave me. But something changed when I walked into Blackwood Castle. He paused, searching for words to explain a transformation that felt more spiritual than practical. I realized that the castle wasn't just my inheritance, I was its inheritance. 25 generations of Blackwoods preserved it, protected it, kept it alive through wars and depressions and centuries of change because they believed someday the right person would come along who understood what it meant. Maybe I'm not that person yet, but I'm willing to become that person. Eleanor was called next, and her testimony transformed the courtroom's atmosphere. She spoke not as a lawyer or advocate, but as a historian who had spent decades studying what made some families capable of preserving legacies across centuries, while others lost everything to time and circumstance. The Blackwood family has always faced challenges, she explained. War, economic hardship, social upheaval. But they survived because each generation produced someone who understood that stewardship isn't about personal comfort, it's about responsibility to something larger than yourself. She turned to look at Caleb with profound respect. In 3 months, Mr. Marsh has done more to restore the castle and strengthen the community than was accomplished in the previous decade. Not because he had money or experience, but because he understood instinctively what the trust was meant to accomplish. The judge's questions grew more specific, more probing. She wanted to understand not just Caleb's intentions, but his concrete plans for the trust's administration, his vision for the castle's future, his commitment to the community that had embraced his family. The trust comes with significant obligations, Justice Thornley noted. Annual charitable contributions, property maintenance, public access requirements. These aren't symbolic responsibilities, they're legal obligations that will define your family's life for generations to come. I understand that, Caleb replied, and I welcome it. My children are learning that privilege comes with responsibility, that being a Blackwood means something more than just having money in the bank. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, Marcus's team made one final attempt to discredit Caleb's claim. They brought in financial experts who testified about the complexity of trust management, psychologists who questioned the wisdom of uprooting children, even historians who suggested the inheritance might be better managed by established institutions. But their arguments felt hollow against the evidence Eleanor presented of Caleb's practical accomplishments, the restoration work already begun, the community partnerships already established, the clear vision already articulated for the Trust's future. Justice Thornley called for closing arguments, and Patterson rose for what everyone expected to be a devastating summary of Caleb's unfitness. Instead, something unexpected happened. The lawyer, who had seemed so confident throughout the proceedings, hesitated, looking at Caleb with what might have been newfound respect. "Your Honor," Patterson said slowly, "the Henderson family's concerns about Mr. Marsh's qualifications remain valid. But it's clear that this case has become about something larger than legal technicalities or financial competence." He paused, seemingly struggling with his next words. "Perhaps the question isn't whether Mr. Marsh is qualified to manage this trust, but whether anyone else would be willing to embrace the responsibilities he's already accepted. The evidence suggests that he understands something about stewardship that can't be taught in business schools or measured by conventional standards." The admission sent shocked murmurs through the courtroom. Even Marcus looked stunned as his own lawyer effectively conceded the moral foundation of Caleb's claim. Eleanor's closing argument was brief and powerful. "This trust has survived 6 centuries because it was always placed in the hands of people who valued legacy over luxury, responsibility over reward. Caleb Marsh may be the most qualified trustee the Blackwood estate has ever had, precisely because he understands that some things are more important than money." Then Justice Thornley retired to consider her decision, leaving the courtroom in tense silence. Caleb sat surrounded by his legal team, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on him. In 2 hours, he would learn whether he was truly worthy of the name he'd inherited, whether his children would grow up as Blackwoods or return to Ohio as the relatives of a man who had reached too far and lost everything in the attempt. The only certainty was that he had finally found the courage to try. 6 months after Justice Thornley's ruling, Caleb stood in the great hall of Blackwood Castle, watching his daughter Emma practice violin beside windows that now gleamed with restored stained glass. The new village foundation charter hung framed on the stone wall, the document that had transformed Thornwick from a dying countryside village into a thriving community that served as a model for rural renewal throughout England. The judge's decision had been swift and unequivocal. This court finds that Caleb Blackwood Marsh is the rightful heir to the Blackwood Trust, both by law and by demonstrated understanding of its purpose. The challenges to his competency are dismissed. The custody claims are denied. The trust shall remain under his administration, with all rights and responsibilities intact. But the real vindication had come in the months that followed, as Caleb proved worthy of the faith Justice Thornley had placed in him. The castle restoration had become a partnership between historical preservation and community development. Local craftsmen worked alongside international experts, learning traditional building techniques while earning wages that allowed them to stay in the village their families had called home for generations. The finished sections glowed with the warm beauty of properly maintained medieval architecture, thick stone walls, soaring wooden beams, and floors that would last another 6 centuries. Michael appeared beside him, now 15 and carrying himself with a confidence that had emerged as he'd learned to see himself not as the son of a failure, but as heir to a legacy of service and stewardship. "The school group from London just arrived," Michael reported. "Eleanor's giving them the tour, but she wanted to know if you'd speak to them about the Trust's educational programs." Caleb smiled. The Blackwood Educational Foundation had become one of their most successful initiatives, bringing students from urban areas to experience countryside life, while supporting local schools with resources they could never have afforded otherwise. Emma had suggested the program after realizing how much she'd learned simply by living in a place where history felt alive. "Tell her I'll be there in a few minutes," Caleb said, then watched his son stride away with the easy authority of someone who knew his place in the world. Lucy bounded into the hall with 8-year-old energy, her arms full of wildflowers she'd picked from the castle's restored gardens. "Dad, Mrs. Chen says the village festival is going to be the biggest ever this year. Are we really going to have knights and everything?" Knights, musicians, craftsmen, demonstrations, and a feast that the whole village will share, Caleb confirmed, helping her arrange the flowers in a vase that had been made by the castle's own pottery workshop, another program that provided both employment and preservation of traditional skills. The Thornwick Renaissance Festival had grown from a small community celebration into an internationally recognized event that brought thousands of visitors to the village each summer. But unlike the commercial exploitation Marcus Henderson had envisioned, the festival remained focused on authentic cultural preservation and community benefit. Eleanor entered the hall carrying a leather portfolio that had become familiar over the months. The Foundation's monthly reports, always delivered in person, because she understood that stewardship required constant attention to detail. "The numbers continue to improve," she announced, settling into the chair beside the great fireplace where they held their informal business meetings. "Village employment is up 40% from last year. 3 new families have moved to Thornwick, and the school enrollment has doubled. The Crown Estate Office sent their congratulations on our rural development model." She opened the portfolio to reveal photographs of other villages that were implementing programs based on the Blackwood model. Heritage preservation, combined with economic development, community ownership balanced with professional management. "There's something else," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the excitement she always felt when discovering historical connections. "I received a call from Lord Edmund's solicitor. Apparently, he left additional documents in his personal effects letters and photographs that were sealed until 1 year after the trust was successfully transferred." She produced an envelope bearing Lord Edmund's familiar seal, its contents having waited for this exact moment when they could be certain the American heir had proven worthy of the complete Blackwood legacy. Inside were photographs spanning decades. Lord Edmund, as a young man working alongside villagers to restore war damage, hosting community celebrations in the Great Hall, overseeing charitable projects that had supported thousands of families over the years. But it was the letter that made Caleb's hands tremble. "My dear American cousin," Eleanor read aloud, "if you are reading this, then you have accomplished what I prayed you. Would you have proven that blood truly runs true, that the values we have preserved for 6 centuries still live in those who carry our name. You have faced the doubt of those who could not understand, the greed of those who would exploit what we have protected, and the fear that comes with accepting responsibility for something larger than yourself. Most importantly, you have chosen service over comfort, legacy over luxury, community over personal gain." Eleanor's voice grew softer as she continued. "The money was never the true inheritance. The castle was never the real treasure. What you inherited was the opportunity to be part of something that has touched thousands of lives across centuries. The chance to add your chapter to a story that began long before you were born and will continue long after you are gone. You have proven yourself worthy not just of our name, but of the trust that name represents." The letter concluded with a passage that brought tears to Caleb's eyes. "Give your children the knowledge that they come from people who chose to preserve rather than consume, who built rather than merely acquired, who understood that true wealth is measured not in what you possess, but in what you give to others. The Blackwood name has been in good hands. May it remain so for another 6 centuries." As evening settled over the countryside, Caleb walked the castle walls alone, as had become his custom. Below him, the village of Thornwick glowed with warm light from windows of homes, where families were gathering for dinner, where children were doing homework, where people were living the secure, meaningful lives that the Blackwood Trust had been created to protect. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Saw the article about the foundation in the Times. Mom would be so proud." The reconciliation with his siblings had taken months, but it had come. David now served as the Trust's legal advisor, his expertise invaluable in navigating the complex regulations governing charitable foundations. Rebecca visited regularly, bringing her own children to experience the magic of a place where their uncle had learned to believe in himself. Even Richard Henderson had grudgingly admitted that Caleb had exceeded expectations. "You've proven me wrong," he'd said during his last visit. "Sarah always said you were capable of extraordinary things. I should have listened to her." Marcus remained the lone holdout, his relationship with the family severed by his inability to accept that some victories couldn't be bought. But even his opposition had served a purpose. It had forced Caleb to prove his worthiness not just to others, but to himself. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Emma peered out onto the wall walk, her violin case in her hand. "The sunset looks beautiful from up here," she said, joining him at the stone battlements. "Are you thinking about Mom?" "Always," Caleb admitted. "But tonight I'm thinking about how proud she would be of who you and Michael and Lucy are becoming." Emma leaned against his side, comfortable in the way children were when they felt completely secure in their place in the world. "Do you ever miss Ohio?" Caleb considered the question seriously. "I miss some things, but this is home now, isn't it? This is where we belong." "This is where we've always belonged," Emma corrected with the wisdom of a child who had never doubted her father's choices. "We just didn't know it yet." As stars appeared over the English countryside, Caleb thought about the journey that had brought them here from a kitchen table covered in overdue bills to a medieval castle, where they were guardians of a legacy that stretched back 25 generations. From being the family that others pitied to being the family that others looked to for leadership and inspiration. The transformation hadn't been about money, though the financial security was undeniably important. It hadn't been about status, though the respect they'd earned in the community was gratifying. It had been about discovering that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things when they had something worth protecting, something worth building, something worth passing on to future generations. The Blackwood ring caught starlight as Caleb adjusted it on his finger, no longer the unfamiliar weight of inherited responsibility, but the comfortable symbol of earned authority. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove worthy of the trust placed in him. The foundation had projects planned across 3 counties, the castle had restoration work scheduled for the next decade, and the village had growth initiatives that would require careful balance between progress and preservation. But tonight, standing on walls that had protected his family for 6 centuries, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of a community that was thriving because of choices he'd had the courage to make, Caleb Marshallord Blackwood felt something he'd never experienced before in his life. He felt like the man Sarah had always believed he could become. And in the great hall below, his children slept deeply in a home that would shelter their children and their children's children for generations yet to come. The Blackwood legacy was secure in hands that understood its true value, preserved by people who knew that some things were worth any sacrifice necessary to protect them. The story that had begun 6 centuries ago would continue, its next chapter written by an American family who had learned that home wasn't a place you were born, but a place where you chose to belong. Some of us know what it feels like to swallow our pride for the sake of our children. Some of us understand the weight of standing at a stranger's door, hat in hand, asking for just one chance to prove our worth. Ben Walker had knocked on dozens of doors that week, each rejection cutting deeper than the last. The single father stood at the gates of the Langston estate with his final notice from the bank crumpled in his truck. When Genevieve Langston opened her door, Ben's rehearsed speech nearly died in his throat. "I'll work for free," he said. "Just give me a chance." The wealthy woman studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Something flickered across her face, recognition or hope she'd thought long buried. "You're the man I've been looking for," she said quietly. But what was she really looking for in a desperate stranger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gravel driveway as Ben Walker's pickup truck coughed to life one more time. He sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his nerves before facing whatever lay ahead at the Langston estate. Through his rear-view mirror, he could see the small silver trailer that had been home for him and his 8-year-old son, Tommy, for the past 3 years. It wasn't moocher double-wide with peeling paint and a front step that wobbled when you put your full weight on it, but it was theirs. Well, it had been theirs, until the factory closed. Ben rubbed his calloused fingers over Tommy's medical bracelet, which he always kept in his shirt pocket during the day. The worn piece of medical alert jewelry had become his talisman, a constant reminder of why he couldn't afford to fail. Tommy needed stability, routine, and most importantly, his specialized therapy sessions that cost more per month than most people made. The boy was still sleeping when Ben left that morning, curled up with his favorite weighted blanket and the stuffed elephant that went everywhere with him. Mrs. Chen from next door would be over soon to get Tommy ready for his day program. She'd been a godsend these past few weeks, refusing to accept payment for watching Tommy while Ben searched for work. "You're a good father, Ben," she'd told him just yesterday, her weathered hands patting his shoulder. "That boy knows he's loved. That's worth more than money." But love didn't pay for rent, and it certainly didn't cover the stack of medical bills that seemed to grow thicker each day. Ben had been a furniture maker for 15 years, working his way up from apprentice to lead craftsman at Morrison's Fine Furniture. He could make a dining room table sing with the grain of the wood, could craft a rocking chair that would last 3 generations. His hands knew the feel of maple and oak, cherry and walnut. They knew the precise pressure needed to guide a handplane, the delicate touch required for final sanding. Those same hands now trembled slightly as he turned off the engine and stepped out into the crisp October air. The Langston estate spread before him like something from a magazine, manicured lawns that seemed to roll on forever, ancient oak trees that must have witnessed 100 seasons, and in the center of it all, a house that belonged in a different century. The main residence was a masterpiece of colonial architecture, all white columns and black shutters, with ivy climbing the brick in perfectly controlled patterns. Ben had heard about Genevieve Langston around town. Everyone had. She was something of a local legend, the tech entrepreneur, who'd sold her software company for more money than most people could comprehend, then moved to their small Virginia town and purchased the old Henderson estate. Some said she was running from something in the city. Others whispered that she was just another rich, eccentric looking to play at country living. What everyone agreed on was that she kept to herself. Ben straightened his shoulders and walked up the curved stone path. His work boots resoled twice, but still solid made soft, crunching sounds on the fallen leaves. He'd worn his best flannel shirt, the blue one that Tommy said made his eyes look like the sky when it's happy. His jeans were clean, his hair combed back, but he still felt like he was wearing a costume to a play where he didn't know his lines. The front door was solid mahogany with brass fixtures that probably cost more than Ben made in a month back when he was making anything at all. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What exactly was he going to say? How do you ask a stranger for work when you have nothing to offer but desperation and a willingness to try? Before he could second-guess himself further, the door opened. Genevieve Langston was not what he'd expected. He'd imagined someone older, perhaps stern and forbidding. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman who couldn't be much older than his own 35 years. She had auburn hair that caught the morning light and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything about him in a single glance. She was beautiful in the way that money allowed, polished, put together, wearing clothes that fit perfectly and probably cost more than Ben's truck. But there was something else there, something that money couldn't buy or hide, a sadness that lived behind her eyes, a careful distance that spoke of someone who'd learned to protect herself from the world. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cultured, careful, not unfriendly but not welcoming either. Ben cleared his throat. "Ma'am, my name is Ben Walker. I was a furniture maker over at Morrison's before they closed down. I heard you might be doing some renovations, and I was wondering if you might need some help." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "What kind of help?" "Anything you need. Carpentry, painting, yard work, repairs. I'm good with my hands, and I'm reliable. I know this might sound strange, but I'll work for free at first. Just give me a chance to show you what I can do." The words hung in the air between them. Ben felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd never begged for anything in his life, but here he was, hat in hand, asking this stranger to take a chance on him. Genevieve's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. She looked at him more carefully now, taking in his worn but clean clothes, his calloused hands, the way he stood straight, despite the obvious difficulty of the moment. "Why?" she asked simply. Ben thought about lying, about crafting some story that would make him sound more dignified. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. "I have a son. He's 8, and he has autism. He needs his therapy, his routine. We're about to lose our home, and I can't let that happen to him. He's already lost too much." The silence stretched between them. A cardinal landed on the porch railing, bright red against the white columns, then flew away again. "You're the man I've been looking for," Genevieve said quietly. Ben blinked, certain he'd misheard. "Ma'am?" "I have a project," she continued, her voice taking on a businesslike tone. "A guest house that needs to be restored. It's been sitting unfinished for 2 years. I've had contractors look at it, but none of them understood what I wanted." She stepped back from the door, gesturing for him to follow. "Come, let me show you." Ben fell into step beside her as they walked around the main house. The grounds were even more impressive up, close everything carefully maintained, but with a naturalness that spoke of someone who understood that beauty shouldn't look forced. "I bought this property 3 years ago," Genevieve said as they walked. The main house was in good condition, but there were several outbuildings that needed work. "I had most of them renovated right away, but the guest house—" She paused, her step faltering slightly. The guest house was a special project. They rounded a corner, and Ben saw it. The structure was solid, a smaller version of the main house's colonial style, but it was clearly unfinished. Windows stood empty of glass, the front porch lacked railings, and scaffolding surrounded one side where work had obviously stopped mid-project. "It was going to be an art studio," Genevieve said, her voice softer now. "My husband was a painter, not professionally, just for pleasure, but he was quite talented. He had such plans for this space." The past tense wasn't lost on Ben. "Was?" "He died 2 years ago. Car accident." The words came out flat, matter of fact, but Ben could hear the carefully controlled emotion underneath. "I hired contractors to finish the work, but they didn't understand his vision. They wanted to make it practical, efficient. They didn't understand that some things are more important than practicality." Ben nodded slowly, looking at the building with new eyes. He could see the potential in the structure, the careful attention to proportions and details that spoke of someone who cared about more than just function. "What would you want me to do?" he asked. "Finish it," she said simply, the way he would have wanted it finished. Ben walked closer to the building, running his hands along the exposed framing. The work that had been done was solid, professional. Someone had started with care and attention to detail. "I'd need to see his plans," Ben said. "Understand what he was envisioning. I have everything. Sketches, notes, even samples of materials he'd chosen." Genevieve's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "I just need someone who can see beyond the obvious. Someone who understands that a building can be more than just wood and nails." Ben turned to face her. "Mrs. Langston, I appreciate the opportunity, but I should be clear about something. I'm not a charity case. I may be down on my luck right now, but I do good work. If you hire me, it'll be because I can do the job right, not because you feel sorry for me." Something changed in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or respect. "Fair enough, Mr. Walker, but I should be equally clear. This isn't a charity project for me either. This matters. This matters more than you can possibly understand right now." They stood there for a moment, sizing each other up. Two people who'd been knocked down by life in different ways, trying to figure out if they could trust each other with something fragile and important. "When would you want to start?" Ben asked. "Tomorrow, if you're available, we can discuss wages." "Let me work for a week first," Ben interrupted. "Let me show you what I can do. If you're satisfied, then we'll talk about payment." Genevieve studied him for a long moment. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," Ben replied honestly. A small smile crossed her face, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her. "I think this might work out, Mr. Walker." As Ben drove home that afternoon, Tommy's medical bracelet still warm in his pocket, he allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Not the desperate, grasping kind that had driven him to knock on door after door, but something steadier, something that felt like it might last. He found Tommy in the living room with Mrs. Chen, working on a puzzle of farm animals. The boy looked up when his father entered, his face lighting up with the pure joy that never failed to make Ben's heart ache with love. "Daddy, look, I found all the horses." Ben knelt down beside his son, examining the puzzle pieces, arranged with Tommy's characteristic precision. "That's wonderful, buddy. You've been busy." Mrs. Chen gathered her things, patting Ben's shoulder as she passed. "Good day?" she asked quietly. "I think so," Ben replied. "I think it might have been a very good day." After she left, Ben sat with Tommy on the couch, watching as his son carefully placed the remaining puzzle pieces. The late afternoon light streamed through their small windows, highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air. Their trailer might not be much, but it was filled with love and laughter and the kind of contentment that couldn't be bought. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of restoring someone else's dreams. Tonight, he would hold his own dreams close and allow himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were both going to be all right. Tommy finished the puzzle and looked up at his father with eyes that held all the trust in the world. "Daddy, are you happy?" Ben smoothed his son's hair, feeling the weight of responsibility and love settle around his shoulders like a familiar coat. "Yeah, buddy, I think I am." Ben arrived at the Langston estate the next morning with his toolbox in the back of his truck and a thermos of coffee that Mrs. Chen had pressed into his hands. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and the morning light painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Genevieve met him at the guest house, dressed in dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than Ben's monthly grocery budget. She carried a leather portfolio under her arm and wore the same carefully composed expression he'd seen the day before. "I brought everything," she said, opening the portfolio. Marcus's sketches, his notes, material samples, everything he planned for this space. She handed him a folder, and Ben opened it carefully. The first thing he saw was a hand-drawn blueprint, water-stained around the edges, but still clear enough to read. The drawing showed the guest house layout with meticulous detail, not just the structural elements, but notes about natural light, views of the garden, the precise placement of easels and storage for art supplies. He was thorough, Ben said, impressed by the attention to detail. "He was a perfectionist," Genevieve replied, "about everything that mattered to him." Ben studied the sketches, noting the way Marcus had planned for the morning light to flood the main studio space, how he'd positioned windows to frame specific views of the estate grounds. This wasn't just a room, it was a sanctuary designed for creativity and contemplation. "This is beautiful work," Ben said honestly. "I can see why you want it finished properly." Genevieve nodded, but something flickered across her face, pain, perhaps, or regret. He spent months planning it. Every detail had meaning. Ben spent the morning examining the existing structure, comparing it to Marcus's plans. The foundation work was solid, the framing expertly done. Someone had started this project with real skill and attention to detail. As he worked, he became aware of Genevieve watching him from a distance, her arms wrapped around herself despite the mild weather. Around noon, Ben climbed down from the scaffolding, where he'd been examining the unfinished roof line. He found Genevieve sitting on the stone steps of the main house, staring at the guest house with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Everything looks good structurally," he reported. "Whoever started this knew what they were doing. The electrical rough is properly done, plumbing's in place. It's really just a matter of finishing work windows, flooring, trim, paint." "Marcus started it himself," she said quietly. "He wasn't a professional, but he was handy. Said he wanted to build his studio with his own hands." She paused, her fingers absently turning a thin gold chain around her neck. "He got the framework up, did most of the rough work. Then she stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Ben sat down beside her on the steps, maintaining a respectful distance. "How long were you married?" 8 years. We met in college, got married right after graduation. He was getting his MBA while I was building my first software company. A small smile crossed her face. He used to joke that he was married to a workaholic who spoke in code. Was he right? Completely. The smile faded. I thought we had all the time in the world to slow down, to enjoy the life we were building. I kept saying next year or after this project. Marcus was the one who convinced me to buy this place, said we needed somewhere to remember what really mattered. Ben nodded, understanding the weight of regret in her voice. He sounds like a wise man. He was, and patient, probably too patient with me. She stood up abruptly. I should let you get back to work. I have some calls to make. But as she turned to go, something made Ben call after her. Mrs. Langston, would it be all right if I looked at more of his things, his tools, maybe some of his paintings? It might help me understand what he was trying to create here. She hesitated, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. Then she nodded. His workshop is in the basement of the main house. I'll show you. The basement workshop was a revelation. Marcus Langston had been a man who appreciated quality and craftsmanship. His tools were organized with military precision hand planes, arranged by size, chisels, sharp and clean, measuring tools that looked like they'd been cared for, like family heirlooms. But there was dust on everything, the kind of dust that accumulates when a space has been abandoned. He spent hours down here, Genevieve said, her voice echoing slightly in the space. Even after long days at his corporate job, he'd come down here to work with his hands, said it kept him grounded. Ben ran his fingers along a workbench that had been worn smooth by years of use. He could see the marks of a craftsman who'd truly loved his work, careful notches for measurements, stains from various finishes, the gentle wear patterns that spoke of countless hours spent creating. Would you mind if I used some of his tools? Ben asked. I have my own, but they were chosen for this project. It seems right. Genevieve's breath caught, and Ben turned to see tears glistening in her eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. It was then that Ben noticed the paintings. They were stacked against the far wall, maybe 20 canvases of various sizes. Most were landscapes views of the estate grounds in different seasons, studies of light and shadow that showed real talent and a deep love of the place. But it was the unfinished canvas on the easel that made Ben's chest tighten. The painting showed the guest house as Marcus had envisioned it when complete. The building glowed with warm light from within, surrounded by carefully tended gardens. Through the large windows, you could just make out the suggestion of an artist at work, brush in hand, captured in a moment of pure creative joy. He was painting his dream, Ben said softly. Genevieve moved to stand beside him, and Ben noticed she was wearing the gold chain outside her sweater now. Hanging from it was a wedding ring, not her own, but a man's ring, worn with age and obviously precious beyond measure. He started that painting the week before he died, she whispered. I found him here that last morning, working on it before he left for his meeting in Richmond. He said he wanted to finish it as a surprise for me, to show me what the guest house would look like when it was done. The silence in the workshop felt heavy with grief and unfinished dreams. Ben understood now why the guest house had sat unfinished for 2 years, why Genevieve had been unable to let contractors complete the work. This wasn't just a build-in, it was a love letter left unfinished. I keep thinking I should donate his art supplies, Genevieve continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Someone else could use them, but I can't seem to. I can't let go. Ben studied the unfinished painting, seeing not just Marcus's vision, but the love that had inspired it. The guest house in the painting wasn't just a build-in, it was a symbol of the life he and Genevieve had planned together, a place where creativity and love could flourish. Maybe, Ben said carefully, the goal isn't to let go. Maybe it's to find a way to honor what he started, while still allowing something new to grow. Genevieve turned to look at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. What do you mean? Finish the guest house the way he planned it, yes, but don't preserve it as a museum. Let it be what he wanted it to, be a place where art happens, where creativity lives. Maybe that's the best way to honor his memory. She was quiet for a long time, her fingers turning the ring on its chain. Finally, she nodded. "You understand," she said simply. "You understand what this means." Ben looked around the workshop one more time, taking in the careful organization, the quality tools, the paintings that spoke of a man who'd found joy in creating beauty. "I think I'm beginning to." As they climbed the stairs back to the main floor, Genevieve paused. "Mr. Walker-Benny wants you to know that this project, finishing Marcus's studio, it's not just about the building. It's about," she struggled for the words, "it's about whether I can find a way to live again instead of just existing." Ben nodded, understanding the weight of what she was entrusting to him. "Then we'll make sure we get it right." That evening, as Ben drove home to Tommy and their small trailer, he found himself thinking about unfinished dreams and the courage it takes to continue someone else's vision. In his shirt pocket, Tommy's medical bracelet seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his heartbeat, reminding him that he too had dreams worth fighting for. The guest house project was no longer just a job, it was a sacred trust, a chance to help someone heal while proving that he was worthy of the faith being placed in him. As he pulled into his driveway and saw Tommy's face in the window, bright with welcome, Ben knew that tomorrow would bring more than just construction work. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate task of finishing what love had started. The next morning, Ben arrived at the estate carrying Marcus's hand-drawn blueprint in a plastic sleeve to protect it from the October drizzle. The water-stained paper had become his roadmap, each faded line and careful notation a glimpse into another man's vision. He'd spent the previous evening studying every detail, making notes in his own careful handwriting about materials and measurements. Genevieve was waiting by the guest house when he arrived, holding 2 steaming coffee mugs. She handed him one without a word black, the way he'd mentioned he liked it the day before. It was a small gesture, but it spoke of someone who paid attention to details. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, watching as Ben spread the blueprint on the makeshift work table he'd set up, "about honoring what Marcus started while letting something new grow." Ben looked up from the plans. "And I want to be involved, not just as someone who signs, checks, and approves decisions. I want to learn, to understand what he was trying to create here." She paused, uncertainty flickering across her face. "If that's all right with you." Ben smiled. "Mrs. Langston, this was his dream. Having you involved in bringing it to life, I think he'd like that very much." They spent the morning going through Marcus's detailed notes together. The man had been meticulous in his planning, noting everything from the angle of natural light at different times of day to the specific type of wood stain he wanted for the interior trim. But more than the technical specifications, his notes revealed his emotional connection to the project. He writes here about wanting the studio to feel like a sanctuary where creativity can flourish without judgment, Ben read aloud. "And look at this note, windows positioned to frame the oak tree where Jen likes to read in the afternoons." Genevieve's breath caught. "I didn't know he'd noticed that." "He noticed everything about you," Ben said gently. "These plans aren't just about building a studio, they're about building a space specifically for the woman he loved." As they worked through the morning, Ben began to see the careful thought behind every decision Marcus had made. The placement of electrical outlets wasn't random, they were positioned to accommodate easels and task lighting in optimal configurations. The storage areas weren't just functional, they were designed to keep art supplies organized, but easily accessible. Even the choice of flooring had been considered from an artist's perspective, selecting materials that would be comfortable to stand on for long periods, but durable enough to withstand paint spills and heavy equipment. "Your husband was a thoughtful man," Ben observed as he measured the space where Marcus had planned built-in storage cabinets. "Sometimes I think he knew me better than I knew myself," Genevieve replied. She was sitting on an overturned bucket, reading through a stack of Marcus's notes. "Listen to this. Jen always says she's not artistic, but I've seen the way she arranges flowers, the way she chooses colors for the house. She has an artist's eye. She just needs the right space to discover it." Ben paused in his measuring. "Do you think he was right?" "I don't know. I've always been focused on practical things, business, technology, solving problems with logic and data. Art seemed like something for other people, people who had time for beauty and creativity. Maybe that's exactly why he wanted to build this for you, Ben suggested, to give you permission to explore that side of yourself. The sound of a car door slamming interrupted their conversation. Through the unfinished windows, they could see a small blue sedan parked near the main house. A moment later, Mrs. Chen appeared, leading Tommy by the hand. "I hope it's all right," the elderly woman called out. Tommy's day program was cancelled because of a stomach bug going around, and he kept asking about seeing where Daddy works. Ben set down his tape measure and walked over to greet his son. Tommy looked around with wide eyes, taking in the skeletal structure of the guest house with the intense focus he brought to anything new and interesting. "Daddy, what are you building?" Tommy asked, his voice carrying the precise diction that came from years of speech therapy. "I'm helping to finish an art studio," Ben explained, kneeling down to Tommy's level. "Remember how you like to draw pictures? This is going to be a special place where someone can make really big pictures." Tommy nodded solemnly, then walked over to where Genevieve was sitting. He studied her with the same intensity he'd given the building. "Are you the lady who owns the big house?" he asked. "I am," Genevieve replied, and Ben was touched to hear her adjust her tone to the gentle, clear way that worked best with Tommy. "My name is Genevieve. You can call me Miss Jen if you'd like." "Miss Jen," Tommy repeated, as if testing how the name felt. "Do you like to draw pictures?" "I'm not very good at it," Genevieve admitted, "but I'm hoping to learn." Tommy considered this seriously. "Daddy says practice makes better, not perfect, because perfect is too hard, just better." Genevieve's eyes met Ben's over Tommy's head, and he saw something soft and wondering in her expression. "That's very wise advice, Tommy." Mrs. Chen settled herself on the stone steps with a book, content to let Tommy explore while staying within sight. Ben returned to his work, but found himself watching as Tommy methodically examined every aspect of the construction site. The boy had a way of seeing details that others missed, and his questions, while sometimes unexpected, often revealed insights that adults overlooked. "Why are there so many windows?" Tommy asked, running his small hand along the frame of what would be the studio's main window. "Because the person who designed this studio wanted lots of natural light," Ben explained. "Light is very important for making art. Like how I need the good light to do my puzzles." Exactly like that. Genevieve watched this exchange with something approaching wonder. Ben could see her taking in the patience he showed with Tommy's questions, the way he treated his son's curiosity as valuable rather than burdensome. "Tommy," she said suddenly, "would you like to see the plans your father is working from?" Tommy nodded eagerly, and Genevieve carefully showed him the blueprint, pointing out different areas and explaining what each space would become. Ben was struck by her natural way with his songe. He didn't talk down to him or oversimplify, but she adjusted her explanations to match his understanding. "This room will have easels for painting," she said, pointing to the main studio space. "And this smaller room will store all the art supplies, brushes and paints and different kinds of paper." "Will you paint pictures of horses?" Tommy asked hopefully. Horses were his current obsession, following a phase of intense interest in farm animals. "I might," Genevieve said seriously. "Would you like that?" "Yes. Horses are beautiful and strong, and they take care of their families." The simple observation hung in the air, and Ben saw Genevieve blink back sudden tears. Tommy had a way of cutting straight to the heart of things with his honest observations. As the afternoon wore on, Ben continued his work, while Tommy helped in the ways an 8-year-old could, sorting screws by size, holding a measuring tape steady, carefully organizing tools in Marcus's toolbox that Ben had brought up from the basement workshop. The boy's need for order and routine actually made him quite helpful, and Ben could see that Genevieve was charmed by Tommy's methodical approach to every task. "He's remarkable," she said quietly during a moment when Tommy was absorbed in arranging paintbrushes by size in Marcus's old brush holder. "He is," Ben agreed. "Different doesn't mean less. It just means he sees the world in his own way." "His mother," Genevieve began, then stopped herself. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "It's all right," Ben said. Sarah died when Tommy was born. Complications during delivery. It's been just the two of us from the beginning. That must have been incredibly difficult. Ben watched his son, who was now explaining to Mrs. Chen the proper way to organize paintbrushes according to both size and type of bristle. It was. But Tommy taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. Patience, for one thing, and how to find joy in small, perfect moments. As if sensing he was being discussed, Tommy looked up and grinned at his father. "Daddy, I organized all the brushes. Miss Jen, when you paint your horse pictures, you'll know exactly which brush to use." "Thank you, Tommy," Genevieve said, her voice slightly husky. "I think you're going to be a very good helper for this project." Later, as Mrs. Chen prepared to take Tommy home for dinner, the boy walked over to Genevieve with something in his small hands. "I made this for you," he said, holding out a small arrangement of fallen leaves he'd gathered and arranged by color gradation. "Daddy says when people are sad, beautiful things help them remember that the world is still good." Genevieve accepted the leaf arrangement with hands that trembled slightly. "It's beautiful, Tommy. Thank you." "You're welcome. Will you be here tomorrow, when Daddy works on your art house?" "I will." "Good. I like you, Miss Jen. You have kind eyes like Daddy." After they left, Ben and Genevieve worked in comfortable silence as the afternoon light began to fade. The guest house was starting to feel less like an abandoned project and more like a place with purpose and future. "He's lucky to have you," Genevieve said eventually. "I'm the lucky one," Ben replied. "Tommy sees the world without pretense or judgment. He reminds me every day what really matters." As they cleaned up for the day, Ben noticed Genevieve carefully placing Tommy's leaf arrangement on the windowsill of what would become the main studio. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes about the kind of person she was beneath her careful reserve. "Same time tomorrow?" Ben asked as they walked back toward the main house. "Yes," Genevieve said. "And Ben, thank you for letting Tommy be part of this. I think Marcus would have loved him." As Ben drove home that evening, he found himself thinking about the way Genevieve had looked at Tommy not with pity or discomfort, but with genuine appreciation for who he was. It had been a long time since someone outside their small circle had seen Tommy's gifts rather than his challenges. Maybe, Ben thought as he pulled into their driveway, this job was going to change more than just his financial situation. Maybe it was going to change all of their lives in ways he was only beginning to understand. Ben had been working at the estate for a week when he first opened Marcus's antique toolbox. It sat on the workbench in the basement workshop like a treasure chest, its brass fittings gleaming despite the dust that had settled on everything else. The toolbox itself was a work of art-dovetailed corners, smooth sliding drawers, and a patina that spoke of decades of careful use. Inside, each tool had its designated place, held secure by custom-fitted compartments lined with green felt. The hand planes were pristine, their blades sharp enough to shave paper-thin curls from a piece of wood. The chisels ranged from delicate quarter-inch blades to hefty 2-inch mortising tools, all bearing the marks of quality craftsmanship. These weren't the tools of a weekend hobbyist. They belonged to someone who understood and respected the art of working with wood. He researched every purchase for months, Genevieve said, appearing at Ben's shoulder as he reverently lifted a shoulder plane from its fitted compartment. He said buying cheap tools was like trying to paint with broken brushes. Ben ran his fingers along the tool's perfectly smooth sole. He was right. These are museum pieces. I've never seen a collection this fine outside of a specialty shop. Use them, Genevieve said firmly. They're meant to be used, not admired. Marcus would be horrified to think they were sitting here gathering dust while his studio remained unfinished. Over the following days, Ben found himself developing an almost spiritual connection to Marcus's tools. Each one had been chosen with specific purpose, and as Ben worked with them, he began to understand the man who had owned them. Marcus had been methodical, patient, someone who believed that the quality of your tools reflected the respect you had for your craft. The windows were the first major milestone. Ben had found Marcus's notes about the custom casements he'd wanted not, the standard vinyl replacements that modern contractors might install, but traditional wood-framed windows that would complement the colonial architecture while providing the specific light qualities an artist needed. The supplier Marcus chose went out of business, Genevieve explained, as they reviewed the window specifications. I've called around, but no one else makes windows exactly like these. Ben studied the detailed drawings Marcus had made. What if we made them ourselves? Could we do that? With these tools and the right lumber, absolutely. It'll take longer than ordering prefab windows, but they'll be exactly what Marcus envisioned. The decision to craft the windows by hand marked a turning point in their working relationship. Genevieve began spending her mornings at the guest house, learning to use some of Marcus's simpler tools while Ben worked on the more complex joinery. She had an intuitive understanding of proportions and design that surprised them both. I never thought I had any artistic ability, she said one morning as she carefully sanded a window mullion. But there's something satisfying about creating something beautiful with your hands. Marcus saw that in you. Ben replied, planing the edge of a window rail with one of Marcus's perfectly tuned planes. His notes are full of observations about your eye for design, your appreciation for quality and beauty. They worked in comfortable companionship, the autumn sun streaming through the open frame where the first window would soon be installed. Ben found himself looking forward to these morning collaborations almost as much as the actual construction work. Genevieve had a quick mind and steady hands, and she asked thoughtful questions that helped him think through problems from new angles. Tommy had become a regular visitor to the worksite after school. His autism gave him an unusual ability to focus on detail work, and he'd appointed himself the official organizer of small parts and hardware. Ben was touched to see how naturally Genevieve included Tommy in their conversations, never talking around him or treating him as if he weren't there. "Tommy, what do you think about this joint?" she asked one afternoon, showing him where Ben had fitted a complex mortise and tenon connection. "Does it look strong enough?" Tommy examined the joint with his characteristic intensity. "It looks like puzzle pieces that fit perfectly," he pronounced. "Daddy makes good puzzles." "Yes, he does," Genevieve agreed, and the warmth in her voice made Ben's chest tighten with an emotion he wasn't quite ready to name. The first real test of their partnership came when they encountered a problem Marcus's plans hadn't anticipated. The foundation had settled slightly over the 2 years since construction had stopped, throwing off some of the measurements for the interior framing. "We could shimming everything to match the original plans," Ben explained, showing Genevieve the survey marks he'd made. "Or we could adjust the design slightly to accommodate the actual conditions." What would Marcus have done? Ben considered the question seriously. "Based on everything I've learned about him, I think he would have found a way to work with what we have, while staying true to his overall vision." They spent the afternoon developing a solution that maintained the proportions and sight lines Marcus had planned, while accommodating the foundation's new reality. It required subtle adjustments to several elements, but the end result would actually improve the natural light flow into the main studio space. "You know," Genevieve said as they reviewed their modified plans, "I think Marcus would approve. He always said the best solutions were the ones that turned problems into opportunities." The work was progressing faster than Ben had expected, partly because of Genevieve's involvement and partly because Marcus's careful planning had eliminated many of the usual delays and complications. But it was also becoming clear that this was more than just a construction project for both of them. One morning in early November, Ben arrived to find Genevieve already at the worksite, standing in what would become the main studio space and looking out through the newly installed windows. She was wearing jeans and an old sweater, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she looked more relaxed than he'd ever seen her. "I dreamed about this room last night," she said without turning around. "I could see it finished easels set up by the windows, canvases stacked along the walls, the smell of oil paint and turpentine in the air." "Marcus's dream?" "No," she said quietly. "Mine." The admission hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Ben busied himself setting up his tools, giving Genevieve space to process whatever she was feeling. "I've been thinking about what Tommy said," she continued. About practice making things better, not perfect. I'd like to try painting again. Again? I took art classes in college before I got swept up in business school and technology and making money. She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. I was never very good at it, but I enjoyed it. I'd forgotten that you could enjoy something without being good at it. Maybe that's part of what Marcus was trying to give you, Ben suggested. Permission to try things without pressure to be perfect. As November progressed, their daily routines at the guest house took on a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for construction work, with Genevieve learning new skills while Ben tackled the more complex carpentry. Afternoons, when Tommy arrived from school, became times for lighter tasks and conversation. Ben found himself sharing stories about his life before Tommy, about his apprenticeship as a furniture maker and the satisfaction he'd found in creating pieces that would last for generations. Genevieve talked about her business career, the challenges of building a company in a male-dominated industry, and the gradual realization that success hadn't brought her the fulfillment she'd expected. Marcus used to say I was so focused on building a future that I forgot to live in the present, she admitted one afternoon as they installed the last of the custom windows. He was right. I thought I could always circle back to the things that mattered once I'd achieved enough success. What changed? Ben asked. He died, she said simply, and I realized that all the success in the world doesn't mean anything if you don't have someone to share it with. That evening, as Ben prepared to leave for the day, Genevieve stopped him by the truck. Ben, I want you to know that this project working with you, watching you with Tommy, seeing this place come to life, it's given me something I didn't even know I'd lost. What's that? Hope, she said. Hope that it's possible to build something new while still honoring what came before. As Ben drove home, he found himself thinking about the subtle changes he'd observed in Genevieve over the past few weeks. The carefully controlled reserve was still there, but it was softening around the edges. She laughed more easily now, especially when Tommy was around. She asked questions with genuine curiosity rather than polite interest. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, Ben caught her studying him with an expression that made his pulse quicken. The guest house was more than half finished now, its bones clearly visible and its final form beginning to emerge. But Ben was beginning to understand that the real construction project wasn't the building at all. It was the careful, delicate work of three wounded people learning to trust each other, learning to believe that it was possible to build something beautiful from the pieces of their broken dreams. Marcus's tools had played their part in that construction too, carrying forward the love and care of their original owner while serving a new purpose in hands that honored their legacy. As Ben carefully cleaned and returned each tool to its designated place in the antique toolbox each evening, he felt the weight of responsibility and the lightness of hope in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring them closer to completion, closer to the moment when they would have to decide what came next. But tonight, Ben allowed himself to imagine a future that included more than just finished carpentry and a steady paycheck. Tonight, he let himself dream of a life built on more than just survival, a life that honored the past while embracing the possibility of love renewed. The unfinished painting sat on its easel like a ghost in the corner of Marcus's basement workshop. Ben had noticed it every time he came down to select tools, but it wasn't until a grey November morning that he finally stopped to study it properly. Marcus had captured the guest house exactly as they were building. The proportions, the light, even the way the morning sun would angle through the east-facing windows. But it was more than architectural accuracy that made the painting remarkable. Marcus had somehow infused it with emotion, with the anticipation of joy and creativity that the space would contain. The brushstrokes were confident but not overworked, showing the hand of someone who painted for love rather than recognition. He started that 3 days before he died. Genevieve's voice came from behind him. Ben turned to find her standing at the foot of the stairs, her face shadowed with the familiar mix of grief and longing he'd learned to recognize. "It's beautiful," Ben said honestly. "He had real talent." He never thought so, always said he was just a businessman who played with paint on weekends. Genevieve moved closer to the easel, her fingers hovering near the canvas without quite touching it. I used to tell him he should show his work, maybe have a little exhibition at the local gallery. He'd just laugh and say his art was for joy, not judgment. Ben looked at the painting again, seeing it through new eyes. Maybe that's the best kind of art. I've been thinking about what you said about finishing what he started while letting something new grow. Genevieve's voice was thoughtful, careful. What if we completed the painting together? I could try to finish what he began. The suggestion hung between them, loaded with significance that went far beyond art. Ben understood that this wasn't just about completing a canvas, it was about Genevieve finding the courage to create something of her own while honoring Marcus's memory. "Do you think you're ready for that?" he asked gently. "I don't know, but I think Marcus would want me to try." That afternoon, when Tommy arrived from school, he found them setting up a makeshift art station in the guest house's main room. Genevieve had brought down some of Marcus's paints and brushes, and Ben had positioned the easel to catch the same light that had inspired the original painting. "Miss Jen, are you going to paint a picture?" Tommy asked with the direct curiosity that made adults either uncomfortable or charmed. Genevieve, Ben was relieved to note, fell into the latter category. "I'm going to try," she said. "Your daddy suggested I might finish a painting that someone else started." Tommy nodded seriously. "Sometimes when I can't finish my puzzles, Mrs. Chen helps me. She says two people can make something better than one person alone." "That's very wise, Tommy," Genevieve said, and Ben saw her glance at him with something that might have been hope. Watching Genevieve paint was like watching someone rediscover a lost language. Her first strokes were tentative, uncertain, but as she began to add details to Marcus's foundation, confidence crept into her movements. She had an intuitive understanding of color and light that surprised them both. "I'd forgotten how peaceful this could be," she murmured, adding subtle highlights to the windows Marcus had sketched in. "When I was painting in college, it was the only time my mind got completely quiet." "Maybe that's what Marcus was trying to give you," Ben suggested, "a way back to that quiet place." Tommy appointed himself the official paint organizer, arranging colors in careful gradations that somehow made perfect sense. His autism gave him an unusual ability to see patterns and relationships that others missed, and Ben was touched to see how naturally Genevieve incorporated his suggestions into her work. "Tommy thinks this yellow needs to be warmer," Genevieve said, mixing a tiny amount of orange into the paint on her palette. "He's right. The light in the morning is golden, not lemony." As the afternoon progressed, Ben found himself dividing his attention between his carpentry work and the quiet scene of Genevieve painting, while Tommy offered his precise observations about color and light. There was something deeply peaceful about the combination of sounds, the whisper of brush against canvas, the gentle tap of his hammer, Tommy's soft humming as he organized supplies. It was during one of these companionable silences that Ben's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice that greeted him when he answered made his blood run cold. "Mr. Walker, this is Jennifer Morrison from the law firm of Morrison Clark Associates. I represent Mr. and Mrs. David Patterson regarding their grandson, Thomas Walker." Ben stepped outside, his heart hammering against his ribs. Tommy's maternal grandparents had been absent from their lives since Sarah's funeral, when they'd made it clear they blamed Ben for their daughter's death. He'd hoped their silence meant they'd moved on. "What can I do for you, Miss Morrison?" he managed to say. "My clients are concerned about Thomas's living situation. They've become aware that you've recently lost your employment and may be facing financial difficulties. They wanted to explore options for ensuring Thomas's stability and well-being." The legal language didn't disguise the threat. Ben closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the life he'd built with Tommy suddenly precarious. "Tommy is fine. We're fine. I have work now. Temporary work, from what we understand. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson have a stable home, excellent schools in their district, and the resources to provide Thomas with the best possible care for his special needs." "Tommy doesn't need the best possible care," Ben said, his voice sharper than he intended. "He needs love and consistency and people who understand him. He has that with me." "Mr. Walker, no one is questioning your love for your son. But love isn't always enough, My clients simply want what's best for Thomas. After the lawyer hung up, Ben stood in the crisp November air, trying to process what had just happened. He'd known this was possible. Tommy's grandparents had money and connections, while Ben had a recently unemployed single father with a special needs child. In the eyes of a family court, he might look like the less stable option. "Ben?" Genevieve's voice came from behind him. "Is everything all right?" He turned to find her standing in the doorway, concern written across her face. Through the window behind her, he could see Tommy carefully arranging paintbrushes, completely absorbed in his task and blissfully unaware that his world might be about to change. "Tommy's grandparents," Ben said, the words tasting bitter. "They're making noises about custody." Genevieve's expression shifted from concern to something fiercer. On what grounds? Financial instability, recent unemployment, the usual concerns about a single father raising a special needs child. Ben ran his hands through his hair, trying to think clearly. "They're not wrong about the finances. Even with this job, I'm barely keeping up with Tommy's therapy costs and the basic bills. But they're wrong about everything else," Genevieve said firmly. "Anyone who spends 5 minutes watching you with Tommy can see that he's thriving in your care." Ben wanted to believe that would be enough, but he'd heard too many stories about family courts prioritizing financial stability over emotional bonds. "They have resources I can't match. Private schools, specialists, college funds. From a practical standpoint, they're idiots," Genevieve interrupted, her cheeks flushed with indignation. "Tommy doesn't need a college fund. He needs his father. He needs someone who sees his gifts instead of his challenges, who celebrates his victories instead of just managing his difficulties." Her fierce defense of Tommy and, by extension, of Ben warmed something in his chest that had been cold with fear. But it also highlighted the distance between their worlds. Genevieve could afford to be indignant about the Pattersons' focus on money because she'd never had to choose between therapy sessions and groceries. "I appreciate that," Ben said carefully. "But the reality is that courts look at practical things. Stable housing, consistent income, educational opportunities. And right now you're employed by me," Genevieve said, "with excellent references and a demonstrated work ethic. If they want to question your stability, they'll have to go through me." The offer was generous, but it also complicated things in ways that Ben wasn't sure either of them was ready to explore. Their working relationship had been gradually shifting into something more personal, but involving Genevieve in a custody battle would change the dynamic entirely. "I can't ask you to do that," he said. "You're not asking, I'm offering." Her green eyes were steady, determined. "Tommy belongs with you, Ben. Anyone with eyes can see that." Before Ben could respond, Tommy appeared in the doorway, his face bright with excitement. "Daddy, Miss Jen, come see what we made. The painting looks just like the real house now." Ben followed Tommy back inside, grateful for the interruption, but aware that the conversation with Genevieve was far from over. The painting on the easel had indeed been transformed. Genevieve had completed Marcus's vision, while adding her own touches, subtle details that brought the scene to life. "It's beautiful," Ben said honestly. "Marcus would be proud." "I think he would be," Genevieve agreed. But her eyes were on Tommy, who was explaining to them in careful detail how he'd helped organize the colors to make the painting process more efficient. Watching his so animated, happy, completely secure in the knowledge that he was loved and valued, Ben felt his resolve strengthen. The Pattersons might have money and lawyers, but they didn't have this. They didn't have the daily miracle of Tommy's trust, the small victories that came from understanding his unique way of seeing the world. "Ben," Genevieve said quietly while Tommy was absorbed in cleaning paintbrushes with his characteristic precision, "I meant what I said about helping with the legal situation." "Why?" The question came out more bluntly than he'd intended. Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, watching Tommy work. "Because watching you with him, seeing the way you've built your entire life around giving him what he needs, reminded me what real love looks like. Not the grand gestures or expensive gifts, but the daily choice to put someone else's happiness before your own." She paused, her fingers unconsciously touching the wedding ring that hung from her necklace. Marcus used to tell me that love isn't about having enough money or the perfect circumstances. It's about showing up every day, regardless of how hard things get. You've been showing up for Tommy his entire life, Ben. That has to count for something. As they cleaned up for the day, Ben found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been a desperate man knocking on doors, willing to work for free just to keep his son's world stable. Now he was caught between the growing warmth of unexpected connection and the cold fear of losing everything that mattered. The painting stood on its easel, a symbol of completion and new beginnings. But Ben was beginning to understand that some things couldn't be finished with brushes and paint. Some things required the kind of courage that had nothing to do with artistic talent and everything to do with faith in the possibility of love. The custody papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a process server who looked apologetic as he handed Ben the manila envelope outside the guest house. Ben's hands shook slightly as he read the legal language that reduced his life with Tommy to a series of allegations and concerns. Inadequate housing, financial instability, inability to provide optimal educational opportunities. Genevieve found him sitting on the stone steps of the main house an hour later, the papers scattered around him like autumn leaves. She took one look at his face and sat down beside him without a word. 60 days, Ben said, his voice hollow. I have 60 days to prove I can provide a stable home environment, or they get temporary custody pending a full hearing. Genevieve picked up one of the papers, scanning the legal terminology with the focused attention she'd once brought to business contracts. This is ridiculous. Listen to this: concerns about the child's educational development in an unconventional family structure. What does that even mean? It means they think Tommy would be better off with grandparents who can afford private schools and live-in tutors than with a father who loves him but works with his hands. Ben scrubbed his face with his palms. Maybe they're right. Don't you dare, Genevieve said sharply. Don't you dare let their money and lawyers make you doubt what you know to be true. Tommy is thriving because of you, not in spite of you. But even as she spoke the words, Ben could see the doubt creeping into her eyes. The reality of his situation, a single father living in a trailer, recently unemployed, facing legal challenges from people with unlimited resources, must look different when viewed through the lens of potential scandal and social judgment. You don't have to get involved in this, he said quietly. I know what it looks like from the outside. Poor man, rich woman, custody battle. People will talk. Let them talk. But her voice lacked the conviction it had held the day before. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black sedan pulling up the circular driveway. Ben watched as two people emerged, a woman in her early 50s, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, and a man about the same age, whose bearing suggested military background or corporate authority. The Pattersons, Ben said, recognizing them from the few photos Sarah had kept. They looked exactly like what they were: successful, well-connected people who were used to getting their way. David Patterson was tall and silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that filled boardrooms and intimidated opponents. His wife Margaret was elegant in the way that money and careful maintenance could achieve, her blonde hair styled in a way that suggested regular appointments at expensive salons. They walked up to the guest house with the confidence of people who owned whatever space they entered. Ben stood to meet them, acutely aware of his work clothes and the sawdust in his hair. Mr. Walker, David Patterson said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, assessing. I'm David Patterson, and this is my wife Margaret. I believe you know why we're here. I do, Ben replied, keeping his voice steady, but I'm not sure why you felt the need to involve lawyers instead of talking to me directly. Margaret Patterson spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the cultured tones of someone educated at prestigious schools. Because talking hasn't worked, Mr. Walker. We've watched from a distance for 8 years, while our grandson lived in circumstances that Sarah never would have accepted. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Ben felt Genevieve stiffen beside him, but he forced himself to remain calm. Tommy is happy and healthy. His doctors will confirm that he's making excellent progress in all his therapies. Progress that could be accelerated with proper resources, David Patterson said. We're not questioning your affection for the boy, but affection isn't enough. Tommy needs specialized education, exposure to cultural opportunities, preparation for a future that extends beyond. He gestured vaguely at the construction site around them. Beyond what? Ben asked, his temper beginning to fray. Beyond honest work? Beyond people who value character over bank accounts? Beyond limitations, Margaret Patterson said sharply. Tommy is a bright child with special needs that require special resources, resources you simply cannot provide. And what do you know about Tommy's needs? Genevieve spoke for the first time, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. When was the last time you saw him? Spoke to him? Attended one of his therapy sessions? The Pattersons turned to look at her with surprise, as if they'd forgotten she was there. Ben saw the moment when they took in her expensive clothes, her confident bearing, the obvious wealth that surrounded them at the estate. I'm sorry, David Patterson said with careful politeness. I don't believe we've been introduced. Genevieve Langston, this is my property, and Ben is my employee. She stood straighter, and Ben could see her shifting into the mode that had made her successful in business. I've had the opportunity to observe both Ben and Tommy extensively over the past several weeks. If you have concerns about Tommy's welfare, I'd be happy to address them. Margaret Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. How nice that Ben has found such a supportive employer. I'm sure that will be noted in our filing. The implication was clear, and Ben felt heat rise in his cheeks. But before he could respond, the sound of a car door slamming drew their attention. Mrs. Chen's blue sedan had pulled up behind the Pattersons' luxury car, and Tommy was climbing out of the passenger seat. "Daddy!" Tommy called out, running toward them with his backpack bouncing. But he stopped short when he saw the strangers, his face shifting into the careful, guarded expression he wore when meeting new people. "Tommy," Ben said gently, "these are your mother's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson." Tommy studied them with the intense focus he brought to anything unfamiliar. After a long moment he said, "You look like Mommy in the pictures." Margaret Patterson's composure cracked slightly. "Hello, Thomas. You've grown so much." "Tommy," he corrected automatically. "I don't like Thomas. It sounds too serious." David Patterson crouched down to Tommy's level, his voice taking on the artificially cheerful tone adults often used with children. "Well, Tommy, how would you like to come visit us for a while? We have a big house with a swimming pool and lots of books." Tommy glanced at his father, then back at the Pattersons. "Will Daddy come too?" "Well, no, but—" "Then no, thank you," Tommy said politely. "I live with Daddy. We're a family." The simple declaration hung in the air, and Ben saw something shift in both Pattersons' expressions. For the first time, they were seeing Tommy not as an abstract child in need of rescue, but as a real person with his own feelings and attachments. "Tommy," Margaret Patterson said, her voice softer now, "we just want what's best for you. We want to make sure you have every opportunity." "I have opportunities," Tommy interrupted, which was unusual for him. He rarely contradicted adults. "I have my therapy with Dr. Martinez and my day program, and Mrs. Chen teaches me to cook, and now I have Miss Jen, who's teaching me about art." He looked at Genevieve with obvious affection. "We're painting a picture together." "That's wonderful, sweetheart," Margaret said, but Ben could see the calculation in her eyes. She was taking note of every detail, every relationship that could be used in court. After the Pattersons left with polite but unmistakable threats about seeing everyone in court, Ben found himself sitting alone in the unfinished guest house. Tommy was inside with Mrs. Chen, working on homework, and Genevieve had retreated to the main house to make some phone calls. When she returned an hour later, her expression was troubled. "I've been thinking," she said, settling beside him on the makeshift bench he'd built from sawhorses and a plank, "about what this custody battle might mean, for all of us." Ben's stomach clenched. "You're reconsidering getting involved?" "I'm considering what's best for Tommy," she said carefully. "Ben, you know I think you're an excellent father, but I also know how these things work. The Pattersons have money and influence. They'll hire investigators, dig into every aspect of your life, and mine too if I'm supporting you." The words she wasn't saying hung between them. Genevieve had wealth and status to protect. A custody battle involving her employee would inevitably attract attention, speculation, gossip that could damage her reputation in ways that might never be repaired. "I understand," Ben said, and he did. He'd been foolish to think that their growing connection could survive the harsh realities of legal warfare and social scrutiny. "Do you?" Genevieve asked. "Because I'm not sure I do. 6 weeks ago, I was living in a house full of memories, going through the motions of life without really living. Then you knocked on my door, and suddenly I remembered what it felt like to hope for something more than just getting through another day." She turned to face him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "But hoping and fighting are different things, and fighting the Pattersons means putting everything I've built here at risk." Ben nodded, understanding the impossible position he'd put her in. "You don't owe me anything, Genevieve. You've already given me more than I had any right to expect." As they sat in the gathering dusk, the guest house around them nearly complete, but their future together suddenly uncertain, Ben realized that some renovations couldn't be finished with tools and determination alone. Some required a kind of courage that had nothing to do with carpentry and everything to do with faith in the possibility that love might be stronger than fear. The custody papers lay on the workbench where he'd left them, a reminder that in 60 days, everything he'd built with Tommy might be torn apart by people who measured love in dollars and opportunities in privilege. But for tonight, he had this moment: the smell of fresh wood shavings, the sound of Tommy's laughter drifting from the main house, and the memory of Genevieve's hand in his as they'd worked together to create something beautiful. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and strategies and the grinding machinery of the legal system. Tonight, he would hold on to hope and try to believe that sometimes love really was enough. Ben was organizing Marcus's tools when he found the letter. It had slipped down between the felt lining and the wooden bottom of the toolbox's smallest drawer, hidden for over 2 years in the one place Genevieve rarely looked. The envelope was cream-colored paper, expensive quality, with "My darling Jen" written across the front in Marcus's careful handwriting. For a moment, Ben considered putting it back, pretending he'd never found it. This was clearly private, meant for Genevieve's eyes alone. But something about the way it had been hidden, deliberately placed where only someone using the tools regularly would discover it, made him hesitate. He climbed the stairs from the basement workshop and found Genevieve in the main studio space of the guest house, putting the finishing touches on their collaborative painting. The late November light streaming through the windows she and Ben had crafted together gave her auburn hair a golden sheen. "Genevieve," he said quietly, "I found something." She looked up from the canvas, a small smile playing at her lips. "Another one of Marcus's detailed notes about proper wood grain orientation." "No." Ben held out the envelope, watching as her expression shifted from mild curiosity to recognition to something that might have been fear. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the letter. "Where did you find this?" "Hidden in the bottom of the tool drawer. I think Marcus wanted it to be discovered by whoever finished his work." Genevieve stared at the envelope for a long moment, as if it might contain something dangerous. "I'm not sure I'm ready to read this. Would you like me to leave you alone?" She looked up at him, her green eyes wide with uncertainty. "No, stay, please." With careful fingers, she opened the envelope and unfolded the pages inside. Ben could see Marcus's handwriting, covering both sides of 3 sheets of paper. Genevieve's eyes moved across the lines, and Ben watched a complex series of emotions cross her face: love, grief, surprise, and something that looked almost like relief. "He knew," she whispered after several minutes of silence. "He knew about his heart condition. The doctors had told him it was serious, possibly fatal, but he never told me." Ben felt his chest tighten. "What does he say?" Genevieve's voice was shaky as she began to read aloud. "My dearest Jen, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and someone else is using my tools to finish our studio. I hope that person understands what this place means to us, what it was always meant to become." She paused, looking up at Ben with tears in her eyes. He goes on to explain about his diagnosis, about why he didn't tell me. He says he didn't want our last months together to be overshadowed by fear and sadness. That sounds like something he would do, Ben said gently, from everything you've told me about him. Genevieve continued reading, her voice growing stronger. But this letter isn't really about me, my darling. It's about you and the life you need to build after I'm gone. I know you, Jen. I know you'll want to preserve everything exactly as it was, turn our home into a shrine to our marriage. Please don't do that. Please don't stop living because I had to stop. Ben watched Genevieve's face as she absorbed her husband's words. He could see the internal struggle, grief and guilt warring with the permission Marcus was giving her from beyond the grave. There's more, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She took a shaky breath and continued. I've been watching you work in the garden, and I see how you light up when you're creating something beautiful. I see the way you arrange flowers, choose colors, solve problems with an artist's instinct, even though you insist you're not creative. The studio I'm building isn't just for me, my love. It's for both of us. It's my gift to the artist in you that I see even when you don't. Genevieve had to stop reading, overcome by emotion. Ben moved closer, offering silent support as she struggled to compose herself. He knew me better than I knew myself, she said when she could speak again. I always thought the studio was his dream, his project, but he was building it for me. What else does he say? Genevieve's hands shook as she found her place in the letter again. And when you're ready, not tomorrow or next month, but when your heart tells you it's time, I want you to find love again. Not to replace what we had, because that's impossible, but to discover what new kind of happiness is possible. She looked up at Ben, her eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. He describes the kind of man he hopes I'll find. Listen to this. I hope you find someone who works with his hands and loves with his whole heart. Someone who understands that the most beautiful things in life are built slowly, with patience and care. Someone who sees your worth not in what you've accomplished, but in who you are when you think no one is watching. The words hung between them like a bridge, neither was quite ready to cross. Ben felt his pulse quicken as he recognized himself in Marcus's description, but he also felt something else, a sharp stab of doubt. Ben, Genevieve said softly, when you first came to my door, when I said you were the man I'd been looking for, you'd already read this letter, Ben said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. You hired me because I fit Marcus's description. No, Genevieve said quickly. I mean, yes, I had read parts of it before, but not this part. I only read the first page, about his diagnosis and his love for me. I couldn't finish it then. It was too painful. But Ben was already stepping back, the tools in his hands suddenly feeling foreign and unwelcome. So everything, this job, this project, whatever this is between yous, it's all because I happened to match your dead husband's checklist for your next relationship. That's not how it happened, Genevieve protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Ben, please, let me explain. What's to explain? Ben's voice was bitter now, all the doubts and insecurities he'd been fighting for weeks, crystallizing into hurt and anger. You weren't looking for Ben Walker. You were looking for Marcus's replacement, someone who worked with his hands and loved with his whole heart, someone close enough to what you'd lost that you could pretend you weren't settling. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. Ben set down the tools he'd been holding with careful precision, his movements deliberate and final. I understand that every conversation we've had, every moment I thought we were connecting, you were just checking off boxes on your dead husband's list. Genevieve stood up, the letter still clutched in her hands. Ben, that's not fair. Yes, Marcus's words resonated with me when I met you. But what I feel for you, what we've built together, that's real. That's not about Marcus. Isn't it? Ben asked. This whole project, bringing his studio to life, using his tools, following his plans, it's all about Marcus. And now I find out I was just another part of his grand design for your future happiness. He walked to the window they'd installed together, looking out at the estate grounds where he'd spent the happiest weeks he'd had in years. I thought I was building something new with you. I thought maybe, for the first time since Sarah died, I'd found someone who saw me for who I am, not just as a solution to their problems. You are, Genevieve said, moving closer. Ben, you have to believe me. Whatever brought you to my door, what I feel for you now has nothing to do with Marcus's letter. But Ben was already shaking his head. I can't do this, Genevieve. I can't be someone's second choice, someone's safe option recommended by their dead husband. I've spent my whole life trying to be worthy of love on my own merits. I won't settle for being a consolation prize, even one chosen by someone as good as Marcus apparently was. He walked to the door, then turned back. I'll finish the guest house. I gave you my word on that, and I keep my promises. But after that, I think it's best if we keep our relationship professional. Ben, please. I need some time to think, he said, about all of this, about what's real and what's just wishful thinking. As Ben drove home that evening, Marcus's letter seemed to burn in his memory. Every word of it made sense. Every observation about the kind of man Genevieve needed was accurate. But that was exactly the problem. He didn't want to be the man Marcus had ordered for Genevieve like a piece of custom furniture. He wanted to be the man she chose for herself, independent of anyone else's recommendations or requirements. The custody battle suddenly seemed like the least of his problems. He could fight the Pattersons with lawyers and character witnesses and documentation of Tommy's happiness and progress. But how did you fight a ghost? How did you compete with a dead man's perfect understanding of the woman you were falling in love with? When he arrived home, Tommy was waiting by the window as always, his face lighting up at the sight of his father. "Daddy, did you finish the pretty house today?" "Almost, buddy," Ben said, pulling his son into a fierce hug. "Almost finished." But as he held Tommy close, Ben realized that some things, once broken, couldn't be repaired with all the skill and tools in the world. Some things required a different kind of craftsmanship altogether, the delicate art of building trust in love that was freely given rather than carefully prescribed. The letter had changed everything, and Ben wasn't sure if what he and Genevieve had been building together could survive the weight of Marcus's loving, well-intentioned manipulation from beyond the grave. 3 weeks of silence stretched between Ben and Genevieve like a chasm that grew wider with each passing day. Ben continued working on the guest house, arriving early and leaving as soon as his contracted hours were complete. Genevieve kept to the main house, though he sometimes caught glimpses of her watching from the windows, her face shadowed with what looked like regret. The guest house was nearly complete, now windows installed, floors finished, the built-in storage cabinets crafted exactly to Marcus's specifications. It was beautiful work, some of the best Ben had ever done, but it felt hollow without the collaborative joy that had marked their earlier efforts. Tommy noticed the change immediately. "Why doesn't Miss Jen come to see us anymore?" he asked one afternoon as Ben packed up his tools. "Did we make her sad?" "No, buddy," Ben said, his heart aching at his son's confusion. "Miss Jen isn't sad because of us. Sometimes grown-ups just need space to figure things out." But even as he said the words, Ben wasn't sure he believed them. Maybe they had made her sad. Maybe the discovery of Marcus's letter had forced her to confront the reality that her feelings for Ben were based on her dead husband's prescription rather than her own heart. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, and Ben's lawyer had warned him that the case wasn't looking good. The Pattersons had hired a team of attorneys and child psychologists who were painting a picture of Ben as a well-meaning but ultimately inadequate guardian. They had documentation of every missed therapy session due to work conflicts, every time Tommy had to stay late at his day program because Ben couldn't pick him up on time, every financial struggle that had impacted their stability. "They're not saying you're a bad father," his lawyer, a kind woman named Sarah Chen, who Mrs. Chen had recommended, explained during their final preparation meeting. "They're saying Tommy deserves better opportunities than you can provide. And legally, that might be enough." It might be. Family courts prioritize the best interests of the child, and if the Pattersons can demonstrate superior resources, educational opportunities, and stability. She shrugged apologetically. "Love matters, but it's not always enough in the eyes of the law. Ben spent that weekend trying to prepare Tommy for the possibility that their life together might change dramatically. But how do you explain to an 8-year-old with autism that strangers in suits might decide he belonged somewhere else? "Tommy," he said on Sunday evening as they sat together on their small couch, "you know how sometimes things change even when we don't want them to." Tommy nodded seriously, like when my day program teacher moved away. "Right. Well, there might be some changes coming for us too. Some people think you might be happier living in a different house." Tommy's face scrunched up in the expression he wore when trying to process something that didn't make sense. "But I'm happy here, with you." "I know you are, buddy, and I'm happy with you too. But sometimes other people think they know what's best for us better than we do." "That's silly," Tommy said with the blunt honesty that cut straight to the heart of things. "Nobody knows me better than you do." Monday morning dawned grey and drizzling, matching Ben's mood as he helped Tommy get ready for school. Mrs. Chen would pick the boy up afterward and keep him until the hearing was over one way or another. "Will you be here when I get home?" Tommy asked as Ben knelt to help him with his backpack. "I hope so," Ben said honestly. "I'm going to try very hard to make sure I am." Tommy hugged him fiercely, his small arms wrapping around Ben's neck with desperate strength. "I love you, Daddy." "I love you too, Tommy, more than anything in the whole world." The courthouse was an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered. Ben met Sarah Chen in the lobby, noting how the Pattersons' legal team filled an entire row of chairs in the waiting area. David and Margaret Patterson looked confident, well-rested, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Ben made in a month. "Mr. Walker," David Patterson approached him before they were called into the courtroom. "I want you to know that we don't take any pleasure in this. We simply want what's best for Tommy." "His name is Tommy," Ben said quietly, "and what's best for him is staying with the father who's loved and cared for him every day of his life." "Love isn't always enough," Margaret Patterson said, echoing the words Ben's own lawyer had used. "Tommy needs stability, educational opportunities, exposure to culture and experiences that will prepare him for the future." "He needs his father," Ben replied. "Everything else is just details." The hearing itself was a blur of testimony and evidence presentation. The Pattersons' lawyers painted a picture of Ben as loving but ultimately limited a man, whose financial struggles and educational background made him unsuitable to guide a gifted child with special needs. They presented reports from expensive specialists, recommendations for private schools that catered to children with autism, projections of Tommy's potential if given access to unlimited resources. Ben's lawyer did her best to counter with evidence of Tommy's happiness and progress under his father's care. She presented glowing reports from Dr. Martinez about Tommy's emotional development, testimony from Mrs. Chen about the loving home environment Ben had created, documentation of every therapy session attended and milestone achieved. But Ben could see the judge weighing practical concerns against emotional bonds, measuring love against opportunity, in ways that reduced his relationship with Tommy to data points and statistics. It was during the afternoon recess that Ben saw her. Genevieve stood in the courthouse lobby, dressed in a navy suit that spoke of both wealth and serious purpose. She was talking to a man in an expensive overcoat, clearly another lawyer, given the briefcase and the way he carried himself with professional authority. Ben's heart lurched at the sight of her, despite everything that had happened between them, despite the hurt and confusion of the past 3 weeks. Seeing her there felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. She looked up and caught his eye across the crowded lobby. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, 3 weeks of silence and misunderstanding stretching between them like a physical barrier. Then she was walking toward him, her heels clicking against the marble floor with determined precision. "Ben," she said when she reached him, "I know you probably don't want to see me right now, but I couldn't let this happen without." "What are you doing here?" he interrupted, acutely aware of the Pattersons and their legal team watching from across the lobby. "I'm here to testify on your behalf," she said simply, "if you'll let me." Ben felt his lawyer appear at his elbow. "Mr. Walker, we need to discuss." "Sarah Chen," Ben said automatically. "This is Genevieve Langston. Genevieve, my attorney." The two women shook hands, and Ben saw his lawyer's eyes widen slightly as she recognized the name. Everyone in their small Virginia town knew who Genevieve Langston was. "Miss Langston," Sarah said carefully, "while we appreciate any support for Ben, I should warn you that character testimony from an employer can sometimes be dismissed as biased or—" "I'm not here as his employer," Genevieve interrupted. "I'm here as someone who has witnessed firsthand the extraordinary father Ben is to Tommy. I'm here because that little boy deserves to stay with the man who has built his entire life around making Tommy feel loved and valued." She turned back to Ben, her green eyes intense with purpose. "I know things have been complicated between us. I know you have every reason to question my motives. But this isn't about us, Ben. This is about Tommy. The Pattersons' lawyers will tear you apart," Ben said. "They'll make it look like you're some wealthy woman who got emotionally involved with her employee. They'll make it seem sordid and inappropriate. Let them try," Genevieve said, and Ben heard the steel that had made her successful in business. "I've faced down boardrooms full of men who thought they could intimidate me. I can handle a few lawyers." Sarah Chen was looking between them with growing understanding. "Miss Langston, what exactly is your relationship with Mr. Walker and Tommy?" "Ben has been restoring a building on my property. During that time, I've had extensive opportunities to observe his parenting. Tommy visits the worksite regularly after school and on weekends. I've seen Ben navigate autism meltdowns with patience that would make professional therapists weep with envy. I've watched him sacrifice his own needs, food, sleep, comfort, to ensure Tommy has everything he needs to thrive." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "More than that, I've seen Tommy with his father. I've seen a child who is completely secure in the knowledge that he is loved unconditionally. The Pattersons can offer private schools and expensive therapies, but they can't offer what Ben gives Tommy every single day, the absolute certainty that he is valued exactly as he is." Before Ben could respond, the bailiff was calling them back into the courtroom. As they filed back in, Ben caught sight of Tommy's drawing tucked into his lawyer's briefcase, a crayon picture Tommy had made, showing the three of them standing in front of the completed guest house, all of them smiling. In Tommy's world, they were already a family. The afternoon session began with the Pattersons' final arguments. Their lead attorney painted a compelling picture of the opportunities they could provide: a specialized schools, unlimited therapy resources, cultural experiences, college preparation that would set Tommy up for lifelong success. "The question before this court," the lawyer concluded, "is not whether Mr. Walker loves his son. Clearly, he does. The question is whether love alone is sufficient when superior alternatives exist. Can this court, in good conscience, deny Thomas Walker the advantages that could transform his life simply because his father means well?" Then it was Sarah Chen's turn to present Ben's case. She called Dr. Martinez, who testified about Tommy's emotional stability and the crucial role his father played in his development. She called Mrs. Chen, who spoke about the loving home Ben had created and the daily acts of devotion she witnessed. And then she called Genevieve. Watching Genevieve take the witness stand, Ben was struck by her poise and determination. She faced the Pattersons' lead attorney with the same calm confidence she'd probably brought to business negotiations worth millions of dollars. "Miss Langston," the Patterson attorney began, his tone suggesting he intended to discredit her testimony before she'd barely begun. "You employ Mr. Walker, is that correct?" "Yes." "And how long have you known him?" "Approximately 2 months." 2 months, the attorney repeated, as if the short time frame proved his point. "And in those 2 months, you've developed quite strong opinions about his fitness as a parent." "I've developed strong convictions based on extensive observation," Genevieve corrected. "Mr. Walker works on my property daily. His son visits frequently. I've had numerous opportunities to observe their relationship." "Miss Langston, isn't it true that you recently lost your husband and might be emotionally vulnerable to a man who presents himself as a devoted single father?" Ben saw Genevieve's jaw tighten, but her voice remained steady. My personal circumstances don't change what I've observed about Ben Walker's parenting. But they might color your perception, might they not? A wealthy widow, a handsome employee in need. Objection, Sarah Chen said sharply. Relevance? Sustained, the judge ruled. Counsel, please focus on the witness's observations regarding the child in question. The attorney changed tactics. Miss Langston, you're not married, correct? You have no children of your own. That's correct. So your opinions about parenting are purely theoretical, based on limited observation rather than actual experience. It was then that Genevieve did something Ben would remember for the rest of his life. She looked directly at Tommy's drawing, which Sarah had placed on the defense table as evidence, and her expression softened with genuine love. You're right that I don't have children of my own, she said, but I know what it looks like when a child feels completely safe and loved. I know what it sounds like when a little boy talks about his daddy with absolute trust and adoration. I know what it means when an 8-year-old with autism, who struggles with change and new situations, immediately feels comfortable enough with his father's presence to explore and learn and grow. She looked directly at the Pattersons. Tommy doesn't need more opportunities. He needs the one person who has never failed him, never questioned his worth, never tried to fix him or change him. He needs his father. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even the Pattersons' attorney seemed momentarily at a loss for words. As Genevieve stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes met Ben's across the courtroom. In that moment, all the hurt and confusion of the past 3 weeks seemed to fall away. Whatever had brought them together, whatever complications Marcus's letter had created, this moment was purely about Tommy and the future they all wanted to protect. The judge called for a recess to review the testimony and evidence. As they waited in the courthouse lobby, Ben found himself standing next to Genevieve near the tall windows that looked out onto the grey December afternoon. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for what you said in there, for being here." "I meant every word," she replied. "Tommy belongs with you, Ben. Anyone with eyes can see that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the rain streak down the windows. Then Genevieve spoke again, her voice so soft he had to lean closer to hear her. "I've been thinking about Marcus's letter," she said, "about what it means and what it doesn't mean." Ben waited, not trusting himself to speak. "Marcus knew me well enough to describe the kind of man who might make me happy," she continued. "But he couldn't have known you, Ben. He couldn't have known your laugh or the way you are with Tommy, or how safe I feel when you're near. He couldn't have known that you'd challenge me to be braver than I thought I could be, or that you'd see something in me worth believing in." She turned to face him fully. "What I feel for you, that's not something Marcus wrote in a letter. That's something we built together, one conversation at a time, one shared moment at a time. And if you'll let me, I'd like to keep building it." Before Ben could respond, the bailiff was calling them back into the courtroom for the judge's decision. As they filed back in, Ben felt something shift inside him, not just hope for the custody decision, but hope for something larger. Hope that love really could be stronger than fear, that trust could be rebuilt, and that families could be formed in ways that honored the past while embracing the future. The judge was ready to render her decision, and Ben's entire future hung in the balance. But for the first time in weeks, he felt like whatever came next, he wouldn't have to face it alone. Judge Patricia Morrison was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that had seen every kind of family drama the court system could produce. She looked over her reading glasses at the assembled parties with the weary wisdom of someone who understood that there were rarely perfect solutions, only degrees of imperfection that had to be weighed and measured. "This case," she began, her voice carrying the authority of 25 years on the bench, "presents the court with a difficult decision between two loving options for Thomas Walker's future. Both parties clearly want what they believe is best for the child." Ben felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Beside him, Sarah Chen sat perfectly still, her pen poised over her legal pad, but her attention completely focused on the judge's words. The petitioners, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, have demonstrated significant financial resources and educational opportunities that could benefit Thomas. They have presented compelling evidence of specialized programs, therapeutic interventions, and long-term planning that would address Thomas's unique needs as he grows into adulthood. Ben's stomach dropped. The judge's tone suggested she was building toward a decision that would tear Tommy away from everything he'd ever known. However, Judge Morrison continued, and Ben felt a flutter of desperate hope. This court must also consider the profound importance of emotional stability and continuity of care in a child's development, particularly for a child with autism spectrum disorder. She looked directly at Ben, and he saw something in her expression that might have been sympathy. Mr. Walker, the testimony presented today paints a picture of a father who has consistently prioritized his son's well-being above his own comfort and convenience. Dr. Martinez's reports indicate that Thomas has made remarkable progress under your care, and that progress appears to be directly linked to the security and unconditional acceptance he receives in your home. The judge paused, consulting her notes. Ms. Langston's testimony was particularly compelling. As an objective observer with no familial connection to either party, her descriptions of the father-son relationship carry significant weight with this court. Ben glanced at Genevieve, who was sitting in the gallery behind him. Her face was composed, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. That said, Judge Morrison continued, and Ben's hope wavered again. This court cannot ignore the practical realities of Mr. Walker's financial situation. The evidence shows a pattern of economic instability that has, at times, impacted Thomas's access to consistent therapy and educational support. David Patterson leaned forward slightly, sensing victory within reach. Therefore, the judge said, her voice taking on the formal tone of legal decision-making, this court awards temporary custody of Thomas Walker to his father, Benjamin Walker, with the following conditions. Ben's knees nearly buckled with relief, but the judge wasn't finished. Mr. Walker, you will have 90 days to demonstrate improved financial stability and housing security. During this period, Thomas will remain in your care, but social services will conduct monthly evaluations to ensure his needs are being met adequately. She looked sternly at Ben over her glasses. If, at the end of 90 days, this court finds that Thomas's circumstances have not improved sufficiently, we will revisit the custody arrangement. The Pattersons' petition will remain active during this probationary period. Sarah Chen was writing furiously, but Ben barely heard the specific conditions the judge was outlining. Tommy was staying with him. For now, at least, they were safe. Furthermore, Judge Morrison added, this court strongly encourages all parties to consider Thomas's best interests above personal grievances. Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, your desire to be involved in your grandson's life is understandable and could be beneficial to him. Perhaps supervised visitation could be arranged to allow Thomas to develop a relationship with his maternal grandparents while maintaining stability in his primary home. The Pattersons' lawyer was already whispering urgently in David Patterson's ear, no doubt explaining the implications of the conditional victory. They had 90 days to prove that Ben couldn't provide adequate stability, and Ben had 90 days to prove that he could. As the court session ended and people began filing out, Ben felt both relief and renewed pressure. He'd won the battle, but the war was far from over. Mr. Walker, Judge Morrison's voice stopped him as he gathered his papers. A word, please. Ben approached the bench, his lawyer beside him. Off the record, the judge said quietly, I believe Thomas belongs with you. Your love for that boy is evident, and his attachment to you is profound. But love alone won't satisfy this court if your living situation deteriorates further. Use these 90 days wisely. Outside the courthouse, Ben found himself surrounded by a small crowd of supporters. Mrs. Chen had arrived just as the session ended, having arranged for a neighbor to watch Tommy. Dr. Martinez had stayed for the decision, offering professional validation for the judge's ruling. But it was Genevieve who reached him first. "Congratulations," she said, and the warmth in her voice made his chest tight with emotion. "Tommy gets to come home." "For now," Ben said, the reality of the 90-day condition tempering his relief. "But I still have to prove I can provide the stability they want." "You will," Genevieve said with quiet confidence. "We will." The pronoun hung between them, loaded with implications that Ben wasn't sure he was ready to explore. But before he could respond, David Patterson was approaching, his wife beside him, and their legal team trailing behind. "Mr. Walker," David said, extending his hand with stiff courtesy, "congratulations on today's outcome." Ben shook the offered hand warily. "Thank you. I want you to know that our interest in Thomas's well-being hasn't ended." Margaret Patterson added, "We hope you'll consider allowing us to be part of his life, as the judge suggested." Ben studied their faces, looking for signs of continued hostility or manipulation. What he saw instead was something he hadn't expected: genuine grief for the daughter they'd lost and sincere concern for the grandson they barely knew. "Tommy is a good kid," Ben said carefully. "He deserves to know about his mother's family, to understand where he comes from. But any relationship has to be on his terms, at his pace." "Of course," David said quickly. "We understand that. We want to be part of his life, if you'll let us." It was a conversation that would require time and careful consideration, but for the first time, Ben could see a path forward that didn't involve lawyers and court battles. Maybe, with patience and compromise, they could all find a way to put Tommy's needs first. As the Pattersons walked away with their legal team, Ben turned to find Tommy racing across the courthouse plaza, Mrs. Chen following behind with an indulgent smile. "Daddy!" Tommy launched himself into Ben's arms with the complete trust that only children possess. "Mrs. Chen said you had to talk to important people about where I live. Did you tell them I live with you?" "I did, buddy," Ben said, holding his son close and breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and the lingering smell of the art supplies from his day program. "I told them we're a family, and families stick together." "Good," Tommy said with the matter-of-fact certainty that cut straight to the heart of things. "I like our family. Can we go home now?" Ben looked around at the people who had gathered to support them, Mrs. Chen with her worried but loving smile, Dr. Martinez with his professional satisfaction at seeing his young patient's stability preserved, Sarah Chen with her briefcase full of legal strategies for the challenges ahead, and Genevieve, standing slightly apart, but watching with an expression that made Ben's heart skip in ways he was finally ready to acknowledge. "Yes," Ben said, lifting Tommy higher in his arms. "Let's go home." But as they walked toward their respective cars, Ben realized that the definition of home was evolving in ways he was only beginning to understand. The next 90 days would determine not just where Tommy lived, but what kind of future they might build together, all of them. The completed guest house gleamed in the pale December sunlight, every detail finished to perfection. Ben stood in the doorway, taking in the space that had consumed his days and, if he was honest, his heart for the past 2 months. The custom windows caught the morning light exactly as Marcus had envisioned. The built-in storage cabinets were fitted with precision that would last generations, and the wide plank floors reflected years of careful craftsmanship. It was beautiful, it was perfect, and it was finished. Genevieve found him there an hour later, holding a brass key in her palm and wearing an expression that mixed pride with something that looked like sadness. "It's done," she said simply, offering him the key. "Everything Marcus dreamed of, everything we worked toward, it's complete." Ben took the key, feeling its weight. Such a small thing to represent so much work, so many shared hours, so many conversations that had changed both of their lives. "It's beautiful," he said, and meant it. "Marcus would be proud." "I think he would be," Genevieve agreed. She walked to the center of the main studio space, turning slowly to take in all the details they'd labored over together. "Ben, we need to talk. About us, about what comes next." The conversation Ben had been both dreading and hoping for had finally arrived. In the days since the custody hearing, they'd been carefully polite with each other, professional but distant, as if neither was sure how to bridge the gap between what they'd been building before Marcus's letter and what they might build going forward. "I have something for you," Genevieve said, walking to where she'd left a leather portfolio on the windowsill. "A business proposition." Ben's heart sank. After everything they'd been through, after the letter and the hearing and the tentative steps toward understanding they'd taken in the courthouse, she was offering him more work. Professional distance disguised as opportunity. "Genevieve, if this is about the 90-day requirement about proving stability—" "It's not charity," she interrupted, opening the portfolio and pulling out a set of documents. "It's a legitimate business opportunity, if you're interested." She handed him the papers, and Ben read with growing amazement. It was a business plan for a high-end restoration company, specializing in historic properties and custom woodworking. The financial projections were conservative but promising, the market analysis thorough and professional. "I've been thinking about what you said, about wanting to be valued for your own merits rather than fitting someone else's prescription," Genevieve said, her voice carefully neutral. "This would be your company, Ben. Your name, your reputation, your decisions. I would be a silent partner, providing initial capital and connections, but the creative and operational control would be entirely yours." Ben stared at the documents, barely able to process what he was seeing. "This is a considerable investment." "It's a smart investment. You're incredibly talented, Ben. I've watched you work, seen the quality of your craftsmanship, observed how you solve problems and manage projects. This region is full of historic properties that need exactly the kind of careful, skilled restoration you can provide." She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, but maintaining the careful distance they'd both been respecting. "More than that," she continued, "this would provide the financial stability you need for Tommy, steady income, health insurance, a professional reputation that would satisfy any family court." Ben looked up from the papers to find her watching him intently. "Why would you do this?" "Because you deserve the chance to build something of your own. Because Tommy deserves to have his father's talents recognized and rewarded appropriately." She paused, her green eyes steady on his. "And because I believe in you, Ben. Not as Marcus's recommended replacement, not as a solution to my loneliness, but as the skilled, principled, extraordinary man you are." The words hit him like a physical force. This wasn't just a business offer, it was Genevieve's way of proving that her feelings for him were separate from her husband's letter, based on her own observations and choices. "There's one condition," she added, and Ben braced himself for the catch he'd been expecting. "You have to want this for yourself, not just as a way to keep Tommy. This offer stands regardless of what happens with the custody situation, regardless of what happens between us personally. I won't have you feeling obligated to me professionally because of anything else." Ben set the papers down on the windowsill and looked out at the estate grounds where he'd spent the happiest working months of his adult life. The offer was generous, more generous than he'd ever dreamed possible. It would solve his financial problems, provide security for Tommy, and give him the professional independence he'd always wanted. But it would also tie him to Genevieve in ways that complicated the already complex emotions between them. "What about us?" he asked quietly. "What about whatever this is that's been growing between us?" Genevieve was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the grain of the custom cabinet he'd built. "I don't know," she admitted. "I know what I hope for, what I dream about when I let myself think past the fear and the complications. But I also know that Marcus's letter changed things for you, made you question whether my feelings are genuine." She turned to face him fully. "So I'm giving you space to decide. Take the business offer or don't, based purely on whether it's right for your career and Tommy's future. And separately, when you're ready, decide whether you want to explore what might be possible between us." It was, Ben realized, exactly what he'd needed to hear. Genevieve was untangling the professional opportunity from their personal connection, giving him the freedom to choose both or either or neither without coercion or obligation. "I need time to think about the business proposal," he said. "It's a big decision, and I want to make sure I'm considering all the implications." Of course, take all the time you need, but I don't need time to think about us. Ben continued, stepping closer to her. I've been thinking about us for weeks, trying to separate what I felt from what Marcus's letter suggested I should feel. And here's what I know. He reached out to touch her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her smooth skin. I know that when you laugh at something Tommy says, my heart does things that have nothing to do with anyone's recommendations. I know that watching you discover your artistic abilities has been one of the greatest joys of my adult life. I know that the way you stood up for me in that courtroom came from your heart, not from any letter. Genevieve's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. I know that what I feel for you is mine, Ben continued. It belongs to us, to the conversations we've had, and the work we've done together, and the way you see the best in both Tommy and me. Marcus may have described the kind of man who could make you happy, but he couldn't have known that you'd make me happier than I ever thought possible. Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her softly at first, then with growing confidence as she kissed him back. It was a kiss that tasted of new beginnings and old fears finally released, of trust rebuilt and love freely chosen. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. So, Genevieve said, her voice slightly unsteady, does this mean you're willing to see where this goes? I'm willing to build something new with you, Ben said. Something that honors what came before but belongs entirely to us. Through the window, they could see Tommy playing in the garden with Mrs. Chen, his laughter carrying on the winter air. He was safe, he was loved, and he was exactly where he belonged. The key to the completed guest house was still in Ben's hand, brass warming under his fingers. It represented an ending, but also a beginning, the completion of Marcus's dream and the foundation for whatever they would build together next. 1 year later, Ben stood in the same doorway of the guest house where he'd received Genevieve's business proposal, but everything had changed. The space that had once been Marcus's planned art studio now served a dual-purpose half workshop for Ben's thriving restoration business, half art studio, where Genevieve spent her mornings painting with the natural light that Marcus had designed the windows to capture. The business had exceeded even Genevieve's optimistic projections. Word of Ben's craftsmanship had spread through the network of historic property owners in Virginia and beyond. He had more work than he could handle, a waiting list of clients, and had even hired 2 apprentices to help with the growing demand. More importantly, he had the professional respect and financial security that had seemed impossible just over a year ago. But it was the personal changes that meant the most. "Daddy, is it time yet?" Tommy asked, appearing in the doorway wearing his best button-down shirt and the navy tie that Genevieve had taught him to knot himself. At 9 years old, he'd grown taller and more confident, his autism still part of who he was, but no longer the defining challenge of his daily life. "Almost, buddy," Ben said, adjusting his own tie. "Miss Jen is still getting ready." "She's not Miss Jen anymore," Tommy corrected with the precision that made adults smile. "Today she becomes Mommy Jen." The title had been Tommy's idea, coined during one of the family meetings they'd started having to discuss important changes before they happened. Ben and Genevieve had planned to let Tommy choose what to call her after the wedding, but he'd solved the problem himself with characteristic efficiency. "You're right," Ben said. "Today she becomes Mommy Jen." Through the window, Ben could see the wedding guests gathering in the garden. It was a small ceremony. Mrs. Chen and Dr. Martinez, Sarah Chen, and her family, some colleagues from Ben's new business, and Genevieve's brother who'd flown in from California. Even David and Margaret Patterson were there, their relationship with Tommy having evolved into something warm and supportive over the months of supervised visits. The past year had taught all of them that families could be complicated and still be loving, that adding people to a child's life didn't diminish existing bonds, but enriched them. "Ben," Genevieve's voice came from behind them, and both father and son turned to see her standing in the main doorway of the house. She wore a simple cream-colored dress that complemented her auburn hair, which she'd left loose the way Tommy liked it. She wasn't traditionally beautiful in the way that magazine covers defined beauty, but she was radiant with happiness and love, and Ben felt his breath catch, just as it had the first time he'd seen her. "You look beautiful," Tommy announced with his characteristic honesty. "Daddy, doesn't Mommy Jen look beautiful?" "She does," Ben said, his voice thick with emotion. "She absolutely does." Genevieve walked over to them, and Tommy immediately took her hand in his a gesture that had once required careful negotiation, but now came naturally. "Are you ready for this?" she asked Ben, but her eyes included Tommy in the question. "We're ready," Tommy answered for both of them. "We've been ready for a long time." The ceremony itself was brief and perfect. They'd written their own vows, standing under the oak tree where Genevieve used to read in the afternoons, the same tree that Marcus had positioned the studio windows to frame. Ben spoke about building something new while honoring what came before, about the difference between replacing love and expanding it. Genevieve talked about second chances and the courage to trust in happiness again. But it was Tommy who provided the moment that had everyone reaching for tissues. When the minister asked if anyone had anything to add before the final pronouncement, Tommy raised his hand. "I want to say something," he announced with the seriousness he brought to important occasions. The minister smiled and gestured for him to continue. "Daddy always says that families are people who take care of each other and love each other, even when things are hard." Tommy said, his voice clear and confident, "Mommy Jen takes care of us and loves us, even when I have bad days. And we take care of her and love her even when she gets paint on her good clothes." He paused, considering his words with the care he brought to everything important. "So, I think we've been a family for a long time already. This is just the party to celebrate it." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden. After the ceremony, as their guests mingled and shared food that Mrs. Chen had spent days preparing, Ben found himself standing in the guest house again, looking at the family portrait that now occupied the place of honor on the main wall. It showed the three of them in front of their homenot, the grand estate, but the renovated cottage on the property that had become their family residence, big enough for all of them, but cozy enough to feel like home. Marcus's portrait still had a place in their living room, but it was part of a gallery now that included photos of their wedding, pictures of Tommy's school achievements, images of Ben's restoration projects, and Genevieve's paintings. The past was honored, but it no longer overshadowed the present. "No regrets?" Genevieve asked, joining him in the quiet space that had brought them together. "Only one," Ben said, and saw worry flicker across her face. "I regret that it took me so long to knock on your door." She laughed, the sound filling the studio with warmth. "You knocked exactly when you were supposed to. Marcus always said timing was everything in both art and life." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching through the windows as Tommy organized the other children at the wedding into some elaborate game that involved careful arrangements of flowers and leaves. His autism still presented challenges, but it also gave him gifts, a unique way of seeing patterns and possibilities that others missed. "What do you think he'd say?" Ben asked quietly. "Marcus, I mean, about all of this." Genevieve considered the question seriously. "I think he'd be happy that his studio is being used the way he intended as, a place where creativity and love can flourish. I think he'd be proud that we found a way to build something new while keeping his memory alive." She leaned against Ben's shoulder, solid and warm and real. "And I think he'd be glad that his letter accomplished exactly what he hoped it would, not by telling us who to love, but by giving us permission to love again." As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows Marcus had planned and Ben had crafted, illuminating the space where Genevieve now created her art, and Ben refined his business plans, the three of them began their official life as a family. Not a replacement for what had been lost, but something entirely new, built on a foundation of trust, strengthened by shared challenges, and blessed with the kind of love that makes ordinary moments feel like miracles. Outside, Tommy's laughter mixed with the sounds of celebration, and Ben realized that sometimes the best dreams are the ones you never dare to imagine, the ones that find you when you're brave enough to knock on a stranger's door and ask for just one chance to prove your worth. He'd asked for work and found a family. He'd offered his skills and discovered his heart. And in the space between what was planned and what was possible, he'd learned that love doesn't follow blueprints or instructions. It builds itself, one careful choice at a time, into something stronger and more beautiful than anything that could ever be designed. The key to the guest house hung on a hook by the door now, no longer a symbol of completion, but of continuity, a reminder that the best spaces are never truly finished, but always growing, always changing, always ready to hold whatever love brings next.